Terence McKenna stands as one of the most provocative and paradoxical figures in 20th century intellectual history. He was simultaneously dismissed as a pseudoscientist by mainstream academia and revered as a visionary philosopher by millions. Born in 1946 and dying in the year 2000, McKenna spent 3 decades elaborating a unique worldview that fused ethnobotany, shamanism, psychedelic phenomenology, linguistics, evolutionary theory, and radical speculation about consciousness itself. What makes McKenna worthy of deep study is not whether his ideas were correct, which is often impossible to determine, but rather how they challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness, and human potential. He asked questions most academics refuse to entertain. He reported experiences most scientists could not explain. And he articulated a vision of human possibility that resonated with people who felt alienated from both religious orthodoxy and scientific materialism. McKenna was not an academic philosopher in the traditional sense. He held no university position, published primarily outside peer-reviewed journals, and built his following through lectures, recordings, and grassroots distribution. Yet his influence pervades contemporary discussions about psychedelics, consciousness studies, and the limits of rationalism. Today, as psychedelic research experiences mainstream scientific legitimacy, McKenna's legacy becomes more complex and worth examining. This comprehensive analysis will explore every major dimension of McKenna's thought. We will examine where his ideas originated, how they connect to broader intellectual traditions, what evidence supports or contradicts them, and why they continue to influence contemporary culture. We will not treat McKenna as either prophet or fraud, but as a serious thinker whose ideas deserve rigorous evaluation. Part 1. The Foundations. Psychedelics as Epistemological Tools. McKenna's entire philosophical edifice rests on a single radical premise, that psychedelic substances provide genuine access to knowledge that cannot be obtained through ordinary consciousness. This is not simply the claim that psychedelics feel profound or produce interesting experiences. McKenna argued something far more controversial, that these substances reveal actual features of reality, consciousness, and possibility that are otherwise hidden. To understand this claim properly, we must first grasp what McKenna meant by epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy concerned with how we know what we know. Throughout Western intellectual history, legitimate knowledge has come from reason, sensory observation, experimentation, or divine revelation. McKenna proposed a 5th category, direct gnosis, through altered states of consciousness induced by specific molecules. McKenna distinguished sharply between different types of psychedelics. He reserved his highest regard for what he called the classical indole hallucinogens, particularly psilocybin mushrooms, dimethyltryptamine, and ayahuasca. He viewed these tryptamines as fundamentally different from substances like LSD or mescaline, though he valued those as well. For McKenna, psilocybin mushrooms held special status because of their natural occurrence, their historical relationship with human cultures, and the specific quality of the experiences they produced. The philosophical core of McKenna's position emerges from his phenomenological descriptions of high-dose psychedelic experiences. He reported that these states revealed several consistent features. First, they dissolved the normal boundary between self and world, revealing consciousness as more fundamental than the subject-object distinction. Second, they presented information in forms that seemed autonomous, intelligent, and other, what McKenna called the presence of an alien intelligence within the psychedelic space. Third, they demonstrated that reality itself possessed far more dimensions, complexity, and strangeness than everyday perception suggested. McKenna emphasized repeatedly that these were not merely hallucinations or distortions of normal perception. He insisted that the entities encountered in deep DMT states, for instance, possessed genuine autonomy and intelligence. He compared the situation to astronomy before the telescope. We could not see the moons of Jupiter until we had the right instrument, but those moons existed regardless of our perception. Similarly, McKenna argued psychedelics were instruments for perceiving aspects of reality that exist independently of whether we can normally see them. This raises an immediate philosophical problem, the problem of verification. If someone reports seeing something only they can see, how do we distinguish genuine discovery from delusion? McKenna acknowledged this challenge, but argued it was not as devastating as critics assumed. He pointed out that multiple people taking the same substance under similar conditions report remarkably consistent features of the experience. The presence of autonomous entities in DMT space, the sense of entering another dimension, the encounter with impossible geometries and information densities, these appear across different individuals, cultures, and time periods. McKenna also argued from analogy. Dreams present seemingly autonomous characters and situations, yet we recognize dreams as generated by our own minds. Does that mean dreams contain no information worth examining? Clearly not, as both psychology and personal insight demonstrate. The psychedelic state might similarly be generated by brain chemistry, while still revealing genuine features of consciousness and perhaps reality itself. The implications of treating psychedelics as epistemological tools were enormous for McKenna. It meant that Western science and philosophy had systematically ignored an entire domain of knowledge for the past several centuries. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason and empiricism, combined with the romantic distrust of intoxication, had created a blind spot in human understanding. Indigenous cultures that maintained psychedelic shamanic practices possessed knowledge that modern civilization had lost or never developed. McKenna went further. He argued that the suppression of psychedelic knowledge was not accidental, but represented a deep anxiety within Western culture about nature, consciousness, and individual experience. The war on drugs became, in his reading, a war on consciousness itself, an attempt to monopolize and control the production of meaning and experience. By criminalizing psychedelics, society criminalized a form of thinking, perceiving, and knowing. Critics have attacked this foundation from multiple angles. Neuroscientists point out that psychedelics work by disrupting normal brain function, particularly in regions associated with the default mode network. What McKenna interpreted as accessing hidden dimensions might simply be the brain processing information incorrectly, producing vivid but meaningless experiences. The consistency of reports across users could reflect common features of human neurology, rather than common features of an external reality. Philosophers of science note that McKenna's epistemology violates basic principles of verification and falsification. If psychedelic insights cannot be tested, reproduced under controlled conditions, or evaluated by independent observers, they fall outside the domain of knowledge as conventionally understood. They might be experiences worth having, but experiences are not the same as knowledge claims about reality. Even sympathetic scholars worry that McKenna conflated the transformative psychological effects of psychedelics with metaphysical claims about the nature of reality. Something can be personally meaningful and life-changing without being literally true. The sense that one has encountered alien intelligence might reflect aspects of one's own unconscious mind, rather than actual non-human entities. McKenna anticipated many of these objections. His response involved several moves. First, he argued that demanding conventional scientific verification for psychedelic phenomena was a category error, like demanding that poetry prove its statements through controlled experiments. Second, he suggested that the distinction between subjective experience and objective reality might itself be problematic, a cultural assumption rather than a metaphysical fact. Third, he maintained that anyone genuinely interested in evaluating his claims should conduct the experiments themselves, that is, take high doses of psychedelics under appropriate conditions. This last point reveals both the strength and weakness of McKenna's position. On one hand, he was right that armchair dismissal of psychedelic phenomenology by people who had never experienced it reflected a kind of willful ignorance. On the other hand, making direct experience a prerequisite for evaluating knowledge claims creates obvious problems. Not everyone can safely use psychedelics, and even those who can might have very different experiences. A methodology available only to some people under some conditions cannot ground universal knowledge claims. The contemporary renaissance in psychedelic research has partially vindicated McKenna's insistence that these substances deserved serious study. Studies at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, and other institutions have documented profound therapeutic effects, enduring personality changes, and mystical experiences that participants rate among the most meaningful events of their lives. However, these studies generally interpret results within a neuroscientific framework, as revealing features of brain function rather than non-physical realities. What remains valuable in McKenna's foundational claim is not necessarily his metaphysical interpretation, but his insistence on taking phenomenology seriously. Whether or not DMT entities exist independently, the experience of encountering them is real and consistent. Whether or not psilocybin opens portals to other dimensions, it reliably produces states of consciousness unlike anything else in human experience. These phenomena demand explanation, and McKenna forced both science and philosophy to acknowledge them. McKenna also recognized something that many contemporary researchers avoid discussing. The psychedelic experience at high doses is genuinely weird in ways that resist easy categorization. It does not feel like normal perception, dreaming, psychosis, or religious ecstasy, though it shares features with all of these. It presents information in alien formats, challenges the coherence of the self, and generates insights that seem to arrive from outside the normal stream of thought. Reducing this to brain chemistry, while scientifically valid, may miss something important about the nature of consciousness itself. Part 2. The Stoned Ape Theory, Evolution and Consciousness. Perhaps no McKenna hypothesis has generated more controversy than what became known as the Stoned Ape Theory. First articulated in his book Food of the Gods, published in 1992, this theory proposed that the rapid expansion of human brain size and cognitive capacity between 2 million and 200,000 years ago resulted from our ancestors consuming psilocybin mushrooms. The theory begins with established evolutionary facts. Approximately 2 million years ago, early hominids in Africa began displaying unprecedented increases in brain volume. Over a relatively short evolutionary timespan, cranial capacity nearly tripled. This expansion was accompanied by the emergence of language, abstract thinking, self-awareness, and symbolic culture. The rapidity of these changes has puzzled evolutionary biologists, as brain tissue is metabolically expensive, and there must have been strong selective pressures to justify such investment. McKenna proposed that psilocybin mushrooms provided those selective pressures. His argument proceeded through several stages. First, he noted that psilocybin mushrooms grow readily in the dung of large herbivores, exactly the animals that early hominids followed and hunted across African grasslands. Our ancestors would have encountered these mushrooms regularly as they tracked game. Second, he argued that even at low doses, psilocybin enhances visual acuity and edge detection, providing hunting advantages. Third, at moderate doses, psilocybin increases sexual arousal and could have provided reproductive advantages. Fourth, at high doses, psilocybin stimulates language formation and abstract thinking. The mechanism McKenna proposed was essentially that psilocybin acted as an evolutionary catalyst. Individuals who consumed mushrooms gained cognitive advantages, improved hunting success, increased reproductive fitness, and enhanced capacity for symbolic thought. Over thousands of generations, these advantages led to selection for larger brains, capable of processing the mushroom-induced cognitive states. Language itself, McKenna argued, might have emerged from the glossolalia and novel associations produced by psilocybin experiences. McKenna connected this hypothesis to broader theories about human evolution. The period in question coincided with significant climate changes in Africa. As forests retreated and grasslands expanded, early hominids were forced into new ecological niches. They became more omnivorous, followed herds, and developed new survival strategies. The mushrooms growing in the dung of these herds represented a novel food source that our ancestors would naturally have explored. He also pointed to the unique relationship between humans and psychoactive plants throughout recorded history. Every human culture has discovered and utilized consciousness-altering substances. This universal tendency suggests deep biological and psychological drives. If our evolution was intertwined with psychoactive plants, particularly mushrooms, it would explain this persistent relationship. The Stoned Ape Theory gained considerable attention in counterculture circles and continues to circulate widely on the Internet. It appeals to people who view psychedelics as fundamentally beneficial and who suspect mainstream science of dismissing important phenomena. The theory offers an origin story that places consciousness alteration at the center of what makes us human. However, the theory faces devastating scientific critiques. First, there is absolutely no archaeological evidence that early hominids consumed psilocybin mushrooms. Mushrooms do not fossilize, so direct evidence would be nearly impossible to find. But this cuts both ways. The lack of evidence cannot support the theory. Second, the timeline does not align well. Brain expansion began around 2 million years ago, but psilocybin mushrooms are not unique to Africa, and their distribution does not correlate with the geographic spread of early hominids. More fundamentally, evolutionary biologists point out that McKenna's proposed mechanism is implausible. For a substance to drive evolutionary change, it must provide consistent selective advantages over many generations. Occasional psychedelic experiences, even if beneficial, would not create strong enough selection pressure to explain the massive investment in brain tissue. The costs of larger brains, including difficult childbirth, extended childhood dependency, and enormous caloric requirements, would outweigh any advantages from sporadic mushroom consumption. Neuroscientists note that enhanced visual acuity from low-dose psilocybin has never been convincingly demonstrated. While some users report subjective improvements in perception, controlled studies show mixed results. The claim that psilocybin enhances hunting ability lacks empirical support. Similarly, while psilocybin does affect sexual function, the relationship is complex and dose-dependent, making it unlikely to provide consistent reproductive advantages. The language component of the theory is perhaps most problematic. Linguists and cognitive scientists studying language evolution point to gradual development of neural structures supporting grammar and syntax. The archaeological record shows slow emergence of symbolic behavior, art, and complex tool use. There is no evidence of sudden linguistic leaps that would match the dramatic effects McKenna attributed to psilocybin. Language requires specific brain structures, particularly in Broca's and Wernicke's areas, that developed over millions of years through ordinary evolutionary processes. McKenna's own background in evolutionary biology was limited. He was an ethnobotanist and philosopher, not a population geneticist or paleoanthropologist. His theory emerged more from intuition and psychedelic gnosis than from careful engagement with the scientific literature on human evolution. When experts in human evolution have addressed the Stoned Ape Theory, they have generally dismissed it as scientifically unfounded speculation. Yet something interesting remains in McKenna's hypothesis beyond its literal claims. He was asking a legitimate question about the relationship between consciousness, culture, and evolution. The role of diet in human brain evolution is well established, particularly the importance of calorie-dense foods like meat and cooked tubers. Whether plants containing psychoactive compounds played any role is an open question, though probably a minor one. More importantly, McKenna was pointing to something underexplored in discussions of human evolution, the evolution of subjective experience itself. We know that human brains grew larger and more complex, but we know far less about when and how features like self-awareness, inner speech, and metacognition emerged. These aspects of consciousness are what make us distinctly human, yet they leave no fossil record. McKenna's error was not in asking about consciousness evolution, but in proposing a simplistic, single-cause explanation. Contemporary researchers studying consciousness evolution focus on factors like social complexity, theory of mind, cooperative hunting, and cultural transmission. These create positive feedback loops where cognitive abilities enable new social structures which select for enhanced cognitive abilities. Language likely co-evolved with these capacities rather than emerging suddenly from psychedelic experiences. Some scholars have attempted to salvage aspects of McKenna's hypothesis by proposing more modest roles for psychoactive plants in human development. Perhaps psilocybin or other compounds contributed to the development of shamanic practices, symbolic thinking, or religious experience in already evolved humans. This is more plausible than the claim that mushrooms caused brain expansion, but it also transforms the hypothesis into something much less dramatic. The Stoned Ape Theory reveals both McKenna's brilliance and his limitations. He had genuine insight into the importance of consciousness and subjective experience in human evolution. He recognized that our relationship with psychoactive plants deserves serious investigation. He asked provocative questions that challenged anthropocentric assumptions about evolution, but he lacked the scientific training and methodological rigor to develop these insights into testable hypotheses. The theory also demonstrates McKenna's tendency toward what might be called psychedelic essentialism, attributing vast explanatory power to psychedelics across different domains. This pattern appears throughout his work. Psychedelics explain human evolution, the nature of reality, the structure of time, the origin of language, and the destiny of consciousness. While this created a compelling unified vision, it also made his ideas vulnerable to criticism when individual claims failed to hold up. What we can take from the Stoned Ape Theory is not its literal truth, but its invitation to think differently about consciousness, evolution, and human origins. McKenna challenged the assumption that human evolution can be explained purely through material factors like diet, climate, and predation pressure. He suggested that subjective experience, altered states, and the exploration of consciousness might have played roles in making us human. Even if his specific mechanism was wrong, the broader question remains worth asking. Part 3. Timewave Zero and Novelty. Theory. Timewave Zero represents McKenna's most ambitious and controversial attempt to create a mathematical description of history and time itself. Developed throughout the 1970s and 80s with help from mathematician Terence McKenna and software developer Peter Meyer, the theory claimed to identify patterns of novelty and habit across time, culminating in a point of infinite novelty that McKenna initially calculated would occur on December 21, 2012. The genesis of Timewave Zero involved both mystical experience and mathematical speculation. During a psychedelic experience in La Carrera, Colombia, in 1971, McKenna and his brother Dennis believed they had received a kind of download or transmission containing information about the structure of time. This experience, which McKenna later described as possibly psychotic, nonetheless planted seeds that grew into novelty theory over the following decades. The core concept is novelty, which McKenna defined as increasing complexity, connectedness, and organization. Novelty represents genuine creativity in the universe, the emergence of new forms, patterns, and possibilities. Its opposite is habit, which represents repetition, entropy, and the wearing down of patterns into sameness. McKenna argued that time itself consists of fluctuations between novelty and habit, and that these fluctuations follow identifiable mathematical patterns. To generate these patterns, McKenna turned to the I Ching, the ancient Chinese divination text based on 64 hexagrams. He believed the I Ching represented a kind of fractal map of temporal dynamics. By treating the sequence of hexagrams as numerical values and applying fractal mathematics, he created a wave function that could be mapped onto historical time. This wave, the time wave, allegedly revealed the ebb and flow of novelty across human history. The mathematical procedure involved several steps. First, McKenna derived a set of numbers from the King-Wen sequence of hexagrams in the I Ching. Second, he applied these numbers recursively at different temporal scales, creating a fractal pattern that repeated at different magnifications. Third, he anchored this pattern to actual historical time by choosing specific historical events as calibration points. Fourth, he used software to generate a graph showing novelty levels across time. When McKenna mapped his time wave onto history, he claimed it revealed remarkable correlations. Peaks of novelty corresponded to major innovations, revolutions, and creative periods. Troughs of habit matched with dark ages, conservative periods, and cultural stagnation. The wave showed increasing frequency of oscillation as it approached the present, suggesting that novelty was accelerating. Most dramatically, McKenna's calculations showed the time wave approaching a vertical asymptote, a point where novelty would become infinite. He called this the transcendental object at the end of time, a moment when everything possible would become actual, when all forms would be exhausted, when history itself would end not through destruction, but through the achievement of complete novelty. His initial calculations placed this event in November 2012, later adjusted to coincide with the end of the Mayan long count calendar on December 21, 2012. McKenna presented Timewave Zero as a scientific hypothesis subject to testing and falsification. The theory made predictions about when novelty spikes would occur, and he encouraged people to check these predictions against historical events. He developed software called Timewave Zero that allowed users to examine any period of history and see what the wave predicted about novelty levels. The theory connects to broader ideas in complexity theory, chaos mathematics, and systems thinking. McKenna was aware of Ilya Prigogine's work on dissipative structures and far from equilibrium thermodynamics. He knew about fractals through Benoit Mandelbrot's research. He understood that complex systems often display scaling properties where patterns repeat at different magnifications. Novelty theory attempted to apply these concepts to history and consciousness. McKenna also linked the time wave to subjective experience of time acceleration. Many people report that time seems to speed up as they age, and that historical change appears to accelerate in the modern era. McKenna argued this was not merely subjective, but reflected an objective property of time itself. Novelty was actually increasing. Events were actually happening faster, and this acceleration had been building throughout cosmic history. The theory offered an alternative to both linear and cyclical models of history. Unlike the Judeo-Christian linear narrative of creation, fall, and redemption, or the secular Enlightenment narrative of progress, novelty theory proposed a complexifying spiral. Unlike cyclical models where history repeats endlessly, the time wave showed patterns recurring at different scales, while also showing overall directionality toward increasing novelty. However, Timewave Zero faces numerous fundamental problems that render it scientifically untenable. First, the mathematical derivation is arbitrary. The choice to use the I Ching as the basis has no justification beyond McKenna's intuition. The King-Wen sequence is not mathematically special, and the procedure for converting hexagrams into numbers involves multiple subjective decisions. Different choices would produce completely different waves. Second, the calibration process is unfalsifiable. McKenna anchored his wave to historical time by choosing events he believed represented novelty peaks, but this introduces confirmation bias. One can always find historical events to match any pattern if one is free to choose which events count as significant. The theory cannot be tested because it can be adjusted to fit any historical data. Third, the concept of novelty itself is poorly defined. What counts as novel depends on perspective, scale, and values. Is the invention of writing more or less novel than the invention of agriculture? Is the Renaissance more novel than the Axial Age? These questions have no objective answers, yet the theory requires assigning numerical novelty values to historical periods. Fourth, the prediction of infinite novelty in 2012 was falsified by the actual year 2012 passing without any transcendental event. McKenna had tied his credibility to this prediction, and when nothing happened, the theory lost what little scientific legitimacy it might have claimed. Defenders argued that something did happen, perhaps at a spiritual or consciousness level, but this kind of post hoc rationalization is characteristic of pseudoscience. Mathematicians and physicists who have examined Timewave Zero dismiss it as numerology rather than mathematics. The fractal properties McKenna claimed are not rigorously demonstrated. The wave function does not arise from any physical principles or natural laws. There is no mechanism by which the I Ching structure would encode information about temporal dynamics. The entire edifice rests on mystical intuition rather than logical derivation or empirical observation. Historians find the theory's treatment of history superficial and Eurocentric. The novelty peaks McKenna identified tend to emphasize Western history and neglect developments in other civilizations. The choice of which events represent novelty reveals cultural biases rather than objective measures. The theory also ignores the fact that different regions and cultures experience different historical trajectories. There is no single global pattern of novelty. Perhaps most problematic is the theory's teleology, its assumption that time is moving toward a predetermined endpoint. Modern physics understands time as a dimension without inherent direction or goal. The universe does not know or care about increasing complexity. Local pockets of increased organization, like living systems, occur through natural processes and are balanced by increasing entropy elsewhere. There is no cosmic drive toward novelty. Yet, despite these fatal flaws, Timewave Zero influenced how many people think about time, history, and consciousness. It gave form to the widespread intuition that something significant is happening in our era, that change is accelerating, that we are approaching some kind of transition point. Whether or not McKenna's mathematics were sound, his phenomenology of temporal acceleration resonated with lived experience in the late 20th century. The theory also raised legitimate questions about time that physics and philosophy continue to explore. Is time fundamental or emergent? Does the arrow of time derive from entropy alone, or are there other factors? Can consciousness affect temporal experience in ways that reflect objective features of time? While McKenna's answers were wrong, his questions touched on genuine mysteries. Some researchers have attempted to salvage aspects of novelty theory by reformulating it without the mystical mathematics. They note that information processing capacity has increased exponentially throughout cosmic history. The universe started with minimal complexity and has produced stars, planets, life, and consciousness through natural processes. This is a kind of increasing novelty, though whether it continues indefinitely or reaches natural limits remains debatable. Timewave Zero also illustrates how psychedelic experiences can generate compelling but false ideas. The La Correra experience gave McKenna absolute conviction in his theory's truth. This conviction survived decades of failed attempts to rigorously justify the mathematics. He believed deeply that the time wave revealed something real about the cosmos, even when he could not explain why or how. This shows both the power and the danger of treating psychedelic insights as literal truth rather than as experiences requiring critical evaluation. In retrospect, Timewave Zero functions better as poetry than as science. It expressed McKenna's sense that time is not merely empty duration, but carries meaning and direction. It articulated his belief that consciousness and complexity matter in cosmic terms. It gave mathematical clothing to mystical intuitions about the specialness of the present moment. As metaphor and myth, the time wave has value. As scientific theory, it is simply wrong. Part 4. The Archaic Revival, Returning to Shamanic Consciousness. The Archaic Revival stands as McKenna's most politically and culturally radical proposal. He argued that modern civilization is fundamentally flawed, based on a wrong turn taken approximately 2,000 years ago, and that humanity must return to modes of consciousness and social organization that characterize the archaic period before the rise of patriarchal, hierarchical, urban civilizations. McKenna used the term archaic to refer to the long period of human history before the Neolithic Revolution, roughly from the emergence of behaviorally modern humans around 50,000 years ago until the development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago. He believed this period represented a kind of golden age when humans lived in egalitarian communities, maintained direct relationship with nature, regularly used psychedelic plants in shamanic contexts, and experienced consciousness in fundamentally different ways than modern people. The core claim is that archaic peoples possess forms of knowledge and modes of being that civilization has lost and desperately needs to recover. These include direct sensory connection to the natural world, integration of visionary experience into daily life, non-hierarchical social structures, balance between masculine and feminine principles, and understanding of consciousness as the primary reality. Modern civilization, in contrast, has created alienation, domination, environmental destruction, and suppression of consciousness exploration. McKenna identified several key features of what he called archaic consciousness. First, regular use of psychedelic plants to access non-ordinary states and receive guidance from nature or spirits. Second, shamanic practices where individuals journey to other realms to gather information and healing. Third, direct democracy and consensus decision-making rather than hierarchical authority. Fourth, goddess worship or recognition of divine feminine rather than male sky gods. Fifth, oral tradition and mythic thinking rather than writing and historical consciousness. He contrasted this sharply with what he termed dominator culture, which arose with agriculture and became consolidated in the great Bronze Age civilizations. Dominator culture brought patriarchy, slavery, warfare, monotheism, literacy, and the subjugation of nature. It created massive technological achievements, but at the cost of human freedom, spiritual connection, and psychological wholeness. The entire arc of recorded history, in McKenna's view, represents a fall from the archaic paradise into increasing domination and control. The mechanism of this fall involved several interrelated developments. Agriculture tied people to fixed locations and created surplus that could be hoarded and controlled. This enabled population growth beyond sustainable levels and created dependency on grain crops. Surplus grain required storage, defense, and administration, leading to cities, armies, and bureaucracies. New social structures emerged based on hierarchy rather than equality, with rulers, priests, warriors, and slaves. McKenna argued that this transition also involved a transformation of consciousness itself. Writing externalized memory and created linear historical thinking that replaced mythic cyclical awareness. Monotheism suppressed polytheistic and animistic religious experience. Most critically, patriarchal cultures suppressed psychedelic shamanism and replaced direct spiritual experience with priestly mediation and dogma. The human mind became narrowed, controlled, and disconnected from its source in nature and the unconscious. The Archaic Revival he proposed was not simple primitivism or literal return to Stone Age conditions. Rather, McKenna advocated a synthesis of archaic consciousness with appropriate modern technologies. He believed psychedelics, virtual reality, global communications networks, and other tools could help modern people recover archaic modes of awareness while retaining beneficial knowledge gained through civilization. This was a forward-looking primitivism, using technology to transcend technology. McKenna saw evidence for the possibility of archaic revival in several cultural trends. The psychedelic counterculture of the 1960s represented one attempt to break free from dominator consciousness. Environmental movements reflected growing awareness of civilization's destructive relationship with nature. Interest in indigenous wisdom and shamanic practices indicated hunger for alternative ways of knowing. The rise of feminism challenged patriarchal structures. All of these suggested that Western civilization was beginning to recognize its own pathology. He also believed that archaic values offered solutions to modern crises. Environmental destruction stemmed from viewing nature as dead matter to be exploited rather than as living presence to be respected. War and oppression derived from hierarchical power structures rather than egalitarian cooperation. Psychological malaise resulted from suppression of consciousness, exploration, and spiritual experience. By reviving archaic attitudes and practices, humanity could heal its relationship with the planet, create more just societies, and restore mental health. The political implications were radical. McKenna called for the dissolution of nation-states, the abolition of standing armies, the legalization of all psychedelic substances, the dismantling of religious hierarchies, and the creation of decentralized communities organized by consensus. He advocated what he called true conservatism, conserving the values and practices that sustained human beings for tens of thousands of years, rather than the recently constructed institutions of dominator civilization. However, the Archaic Revival thesis faces serious historical and anthropological challenges. First, the picture of archaic life as peaceful and egalitarian is romanticized. Archaeological evidence shows that violence, warfare, and social inequality existed in many hunter-gatherer societies. Prehistoric humans hunted numerous species to extinction. There was no universal golden age, rather diverse societies with varying levels of cooperation and conflict. Second, the sharp distinction between archaic and dominator cultures oversimplifies human history. The transition to agriculture happened independently in multiple regions at different times for different reasons. Many agricultural societies maintained egalitarian structures for centuries. Some hunter-gatherer societies were hierarchical. Literacy, monotheism, and patriarchy emerged through complex historical processes that cannot be reduced to a single wrong turn. Third, anthropologists point out that McKenna's understanding of shamanism and indigenous cultures was selective and idealized. He emphasized examples that fit his narrative while ignoring contrary cases. Many shamanic traditions are quite authoritarian, with powerful shamans controlling access to spiritual knowledge. Indigenous societies have their own forms of social control, violence, and oppression. They are not living examples of archaic paradise, but complex cultures with their own problems and contradictions. Fourth, the idea that we can or should return to archaic consciousness ignores the fact that consciousness co-evolves with material conditions and cultural practices. Hunter-gatherers did not think differently just because they took psychedelics, but because their entire way of life, their economic base, their social organization, and their physical environment were different. Modern people using psychedelics in cities do not magically acquire archaic consciousness. Fifth, McKenna's critique of civilization, while containing valid points, relies on a false dichotomy. Not all modern developments are bad, and not all ancient practices are good. Literacy enabled the preservation and transmission of knowledge. Agriculture allowed population growth and cultural complexity. Modern medicine has dramatically reduced suffering. We cannot simply reject all of civilization without rejecting many genuine goods. The concept of dominator culture itself has been questioned. While patriarchy and hierarchy certainly exist and deserve critique, the term lumps together diverse historical phenomena under a single negative label. Different civilizations develop different balances of cooperation and domination, egalitarianism and hierarchy. Some agricultural societies maintained goddess worship for millennia. Some developed sophisticated ecological knowledge and sustainable practices. History is more complex than a fall from grace narrative allows. Scholars studying the origins of agriculture now understand it as a gradual process driven by multiple factors, including climate change, population pressure, and opportunistic cultivation of wild plants. It was not a conscious choice to enslave humanity, but a series of adaptations to changing conditions. Once populations grew dependent on crops, returning to foraging became impossible regardless of anyone's preferences. This does not justify all consequences of agriculture, but complicates the idea of a deliberate wrong turn. The political vision McKenna offered, while appealing to many, faces practical impossibilities. 7 billion people cannot live as hunter-gatherers on a planet already stripped of megafauna and with degraded ecosystems. Decentralized consensus communities work at small scale, but become unworkable as populations grow. The technologies McKenna wanted to retain require industrial infrastructure, global supply chains, and specialized expertise that depend on civilization's organizational structures. Yet, despite these problems, the Archaic Revival contains important insights. McKenna was right that civilization has created profound alienation and that modern life disconnects people from nature, body, and direct experience. He recognized that indigenous and ancient cultures possessed knowledge about consciousness, healing, and ecology that the modern world has discounted. His critique of hierarchy, patriarchy, and cultural suppression of altered states identifies real problems deserving serious attention. The ecological crisis validates McKenna's concerns about civilization's trajectory. The dominator attitude toward nature he critiqued, treating the planet as resource to be exploited, has brought us to the brink of catastrophic climate change and mass extinction. Indigenous peoples who maintained more reciprocal relationships with ecosystems often managed resources sustainably for thousands of years. Whatever we call it, there is wisdom in older ways of living with the earth that industrial civilization has lost. Similarly, the mental health crisis in developed nations suggests something genuinely amiss in modern consciousness. Depression, anxiety, addiction, and spiritual emptiness affect huge portions of the population. The suppression of psychedelic medicines, now being reversed, has deprived people of tools that many cultures used for healing and integration. McKenna was right that consciousness exploration has been pathologized and criminalized in ways that serve social control rather than well-being. The feminist movement's critique of patriarchy vindicates aspects of McKenna's analysis, even if his historical account was oversimplified. Domination of women by men, suppression of the feminine in culture and religion, and privileging of masculine modes of knowing all deserve challenge and transformation. Some prehistoric societies may have been more gender egalitarian, and recovering those patterns could inform contemporary efforts toward equality. What remains valuable in the Archaic Revival is not its literal program, but its invitation to question civilization's assumptions. Why do we organize society hierarchically? Why do we treat nature as separate from humanity? Why do we suppress consciousness exploration? Why do we privilege rationality over intuition, mind over body, culture over nature? McKenna forced these questions into public discourse, even if his answers were problematic. Contemporary movements in rewilding, permaculture, entheogenic healing and eco-psychology carry forward aspects of McKenna's vision while avoiding his romanticization of the past. These approaches seek to learn from indigenous wisdom and prehistoric practices without claiming to recreate them exactly. They acknowledge that we must move forward, not backward, but insist that we can do so while recovering values and knowledge that civilization has suppressed. Part 5. Language, Logos, and the Structure of Reality. McKenna's ideas about language stand among his most philosophically sophisticated contributions. He proposed that language is not merely a tool for communication, but a fundamental force shaping consciousness and reality itself. This elevated language from practical utility to cosmic significance, making it central to understanding what humans are and what the universe is becoming. The foundation of McKenna's language philosophy comes from the concept of logos, a term from Greek philosophy meaning word, reason, or cosmic ordering principle. In ancient thought, particularly in Heraclitus, and later in Stoicism and Christian theology, logos represented the rational structure underlying reality. McKenna reinterpreted logos as the dimension of meaning, pattern, and articulation that pervades existence. Language, in this view, does not describe reality, but participates in reality's self-organization. McKenna drew heavily on the linguistic philosophy of the 20th century, particularly the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argued that the limits of language are the limits of our world. He was influenced by Benjamin Lee Whorf's controversial hypothesis that language structures thought and perception so that speakers of different languages literally inhabit different conceptual universes. He engaged with post-structuralist thinkers like Jacques Derrida, who questioned the stability of meaning and the relationship between signifiers and signified. But McKenna pushed these ideas in directions that most academic philosophers would not follow. He claimed that reality itself has a linguistic structure, that the patterns in language mirror fundamental patterns in the cosmos. He suggested that the human capacity for language represents the universe becoming conscious of itself, articulating its own nature through us. Most provocatively, he argued that sufficiently advanced language could actually create or alter reality rather than merely describing it. This last claim connects to his experiences with psychedelics, particularly DMT. In the DMT state, McKenna reported encountering entities that communicated in a language unlike anything in ordinary reality. This language operated through visible, tangible morphology. Ideas appeared as three-dimensional structures that could be rotated, examined, and inhabited. Meaning was not conveyed through arbitrary symbols, but through direct presentation of forms. Understanding did not require translation, but happened through a kind of synesthesia, where concepts could be seen, heard, and felt simultaneously. McKenna called these forms self-transforming machine elves or hyperdimensional entities, and he insisted they demonstrated genuine intelligence and intentionality. They seemed to be made of language, or to exist in a dimension where the distinction between being and meaning had collapsed. Encountering them suggested to McKenna that ordinary language represents a limited, degraded version of a more primary cosmic language that directly manifests reality. He developed what he called the logos of the imagination, arguing that human imagination is not merely fantasy, but a kind of proto-reality, a space where potential forms exist before manifesting physically. The imagination, in this view, functions as an interface between consciousness and the generative ground of being. What we imagine today can become physical reality tomorrow through technology, art, and culture. Therefore, imagination deserves recognition as a causal force in the universe. McKenna connected these ideas to the history of language and the emergence of human consciousness. He speculated that language evolved from gesture and sound into increasingly abstract symbol systems, and that this evolution was not merely biological, but represented consciousness gaining new capabilities. Writing marked a crucial transition, externalizing memory and enabling cumulative cultural knowledge. Each development in language, from writing to printing to digital media, transformed what humans could think and do. He was particularly interested in what he called the visible language of the psychedelic experience. While ordinary language operates through arbitrary signs that require learning and cultural transmission, the entities and forms encountered on DMT seemed to communicate through direct presentation of meaning. This suggested to McKenna that language as we know it is a relatively recent and possibly temporary phase in the evolution of communication and consciousness. Technology plays a crucial role in this vision. McKenna believed virtual reality and other emerging technologies would enable new forms of communication that transcend the limitations of natural language. Instead of describing experiences or ideas through words, people could directly share experiential constructs, entering each other's imaginative spaces. This would represent a recovery of something like the visible language of the psychedelic state, but through technological means accessible to everyone. The political and cultural implications were significant. If language structures reality, then those who control language control reality itself. The dominator cultures McKenna critiqued maintain power partly through linguistic control, defining what can be said, thought, and imagined. Liberation requires linguistic liberation, creating new vocabularies and new modes of expression that escape the constraints of dominator discourse. Psychedelics offer one route to such liberation by revealing the contingency and limitations of ordinary language. McKenna also explored the relationship between language and time. He noticed that the psychedelic state often involves temporal distortion, with experiences that seem to last eternally occurring in minutes of clock time. He connected this to the idea that time is a linguistic construct, a way of organizing experience rather than an objective feature of reality. If language creates the framework through which we experience temporal flow, then altering language or transcending it might reveal time as fundamentally different than we normally conceive. However, McKenna's language philosophy faces several serious challenges. First, the claim that reality has linguistic structure confuses epistemology with ontology, how we know things with what things are. That we use language to describe patterns in nature does not mean nature is made of language. The mathematical structures physicists discover exist independently of human description. We did not create atoms or electromagnetic fields by naming them. Second, the Hawfian hypothesis that language determines thought has been largely rejected by contemporary linguistics and cognitive science. While language influences thought, speakers of all languages can learn new concepts and express them. There is no evidence that language radically limits cognitive possibilities. Humans share common conceptual structures that transcend linguistic differences. Third, the reports of entities communicating through visible language in DMT experiences are subjective phenomenology, not evidence about objective reality. The brain, under the influence of powerful psychedelics, generates unusual experiences. But these experiences are neural events, not encounters with external dimensions. The feeling of communicating with autonomous entities likely reflects aspects of one's own mind rather than actual non-human intelligences. Fourth, the idea that language or imagination can directly create reality contradicts everything we know about physics and causation. Thinking about something does not make it real. Imagining a better world does not bring that world into being. The causal arrow runs from reality to representation, not the reverse. While imagination can guide action that changes reality, this is not the same as imagination directly manifesting reality. Linguists and philosophers of language find McKenna's ideas interesting, but ultimately confused. He mixed together legitimate philosophical problems about the nature of meaning with mystical speculation about cosmic consciousness. His reading of thinkers like Wittgenstein was creative, but not always accurate. Wittgenstein's claim about the limits of language concerned logical limits of meaningful expression, not metaphysical constraints on reality itself. The visible language McKenna reported from DMT experiences has been studied by researchers, and explanations exist that do not require positing other dimensions or autonomous entities. The visual cortex under psychedelics generates geometric patterns and complex forms through its intrinsic connectivity and dynamics. The sense that these forms carry meaning likely results from pattern recognition systems operating in altered mode, finding significance in internally generated noise. This does not diminish the experiential intensity, but locates it in neurology rather than metaphysics. Yet McKenna touched on genuine mysteries about language that remain philosophically live. How does meaning arise from physical processes in brains? Why do humans have such elaborate language capabilities far beyond what seems necessary for survival? What is the relationship between linguistic structures and structures in mathematics, logic, and nature? These questions deserve serious investigation, even if McKenna's answers were speculative. His emphasis on the creative and world-making power of language connects to important currents in philosophy. From Nietzsche's perspectivism to social constructivism to contemporary embodied cognition research, thinkers have recognized that language does not neutrally mirror reality, but actively shapes how we experience and interact with the world. While this does not mean language creates reality ex nihilo, it means language has causal efficacy in structuring human experience and culture. The idea that language and consciousness co-evolve receives support from cognitive anthropology and linguistics. The capacity for language required specific anatomical and neural changes that occurred over millions of years. Language enabled new forms of social cooperation, cultural transmission, and abstract thinking. This created feedback loops where language and cognition mutually influenced each other's development. In this more modest sense, McKenna was right that language transformed human consciousness. Contemporary work on extended mind and distributed cognition provides frameworks for understanding how language extends cognitive capacities. When we use language to organize thought, collaborate, or create external representations, we are genuinely thinking through and with language. The boundary between mind and language becomes porous. This vindicates some of McKenna's intuitions while remaining within naturalistic explanation. The prospect of new communication technologies that bypass natural language remains actively discussed in fields like brain-computer interfaces and virtual reality. While we are far from the telepathic merging McKenna imagined, researchers are developing ways to share experiences more directly through immersive media. Whether this represents genuine advance or loss of the nuance and ambiguity that make language powerful remains debatable. What makes McKenna's language philosophy valuable, despite its flaws, is how it reframes fundamental questions. Instead of treating language as mere tool, he invited us to consider it as cosmos reaching towards self-awareness. Instead of dismissing mystical experiences of living language, he asked what they might reveal about consciousness and meaning. Instead of accepting current limitations as final, he imagined futures where communication transcends present constraints. These provocations remain fertile even when the specific claims fail. Part 6. The Transcendental Object at the End of Time. The transcendental object represents McKenna's most mystical and least empirically grounded concept. He used this term to describe a strange attractor at the end of history, a kind of cosmic goal or omega point toward which all events are drawn. This object exists outside ordinary space-time, yet exerts influence on temporal processes, shaping history from the future rather than the past. McKenna derived this idea from multiple sources. From Whitehead's process, philosophy came the notion that the future can have causal influence on the present. From Teilhard de Chardin came the concept of the omega point, an eventual convergence of consciousness at the end of evolution. From eschatological traditions in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other religions came images of final culmination and apocalypse. From psychedelic experiences came direct encounters with what seemed to be a transcendent presence or attractor. The transcendental object is difficult to characterize precisely because McKenna insisted it transcended ordinary categories. It is neither material nor purely mental, neither in time nor outside time, neither conscious nor unconscious in normal senses. He sometimes described it as the totality of all possible forms, the exhaustion of novelty, the achievement of complete complexity. Other times, he suggested it was a hyperdimensional entity or intelligence that humanity would merge with or become. In McKenna's cosmology, the transcendental object functions as both destination and cause. All of history has been driven by the attraction toward this object. The increasing complexity in the universe, the emergence of life, the evolution of consciousness, the development of technology, all represent the cosmos moving toward union with the transcendental object. Yet, because this object exists at the end of time, it has always already been there, calling everything toward itself. This creates a paradoxical temporal structure. The future attracts the present, but the future is created by the present. The transcendental object makes history possible by providing direction and meaning, yet it only comes into being through the historical process it guides. McKenna embraced this paradox, suggesting that conventional linear causality breaks down when dealing with truly transcendent realities. He connected the transcendental object to his Timewave Zero theory. The point of infinite novelty at the end of the time wave was essentially the transcendental object manifesting fully in space-time. As novelty accelerated throughout history, reality was approaching an asymptotic limit where everything possible would become actual. At that moment, the distinction between potential and actual, future and present, consciousness and cosmos would collapse. McKenna used various metaphors to convey the nature of this object. He compared it to a black hole in time that draws all events toward itself. He likened it to a hologram where the complete pattern exists implicitly in each part. He described it as the chrysalis state of humanity, with our entire history being a metamorphosis toward unimaginable transformation. He suggested it might be the human species itself, viewed from its completed future state, reaching back to guide its own development. The psychedelic experience provided McKenna's primary evidence for the transcendental object's reality. He reported that high-dose psilocybin and DMT journeys consistently revealed a sense of being in the presence of something vast, intelligent, and beckoning. This presence seemed to exist outside normal reality, yet to be intimately connected with human consciousness and destiny. It communicated, though not in words, a sense that everything was proceeding according to plan, that history had meaning, that something wonderful awaited. McKenna interpreted various cultural phenomena as manifestations of, or responses to, the transcendental object. Religious experiences represent glimpses of this object filtered through cultural frameworks. Artistic creativity draws energy from it. Scientific discovery reveals aspects of its nature. Technological development builds instruments that will eventually enable direct contact. Even the anxiety and chaos of modernity reflect the disruptive influence of the object's approach. He believed that the transcendental object could not be described in rational language because it transcended the categories that make rational discourse possible. Any attempt to pin it down with definitions would fail because it exceeds all definitions. The best one could do was use poetic, metaphorical, and paradoxical language that gestured toward its nature without claiming to capture it fully. In some descriptions, McKenna identified the transcendental object with the psychedelic mushroom itself, or more precisely, with the intelligence manifesting through the mushroom. He suggested that mushrooms represented an alien life form, perhaps extraterrestrial in origin, that had co-evolved with humans for specific purposes. The mushroom was the transcendental object's ambassador, its way of communicating with and guiding human consciousness. The implications for human destiny were dramatic. McKenna believed we were living in the end times, not in the sense of destruction, but of fulfillment. The chaos and acceleration of modern life signaled the imminence of the transcendental object's full manifestation. Within decades or centuries, humanity would undergo transformation so complete that what came after would be unrecognizable from present perspective. This could involve technological singularity, consciousness merging into global unity, dimensional shift, or something entirely unanticipated. However, the concept of the transcendental object faces insurmountable philosophical and scientific problems. First, it violates basic principles of causation. Effects follow causes in time. They do not precede them. The idea that future events can influence past or present contradicts everything we know about physics. While quantum mechanics involves temporal peculiarities, nothing in quantum theory supports the kind of backward causation McKenna proposed. Second, the concept is completely unfalsifiable. Because the object transcends normal categories and cannot be described precisely, no observation could confirm or disconfirm its existence. Any historical event can be interpreted as reflecting the object's influence. Any failure of specific predictions can be dismissed as misunderstanding the object's nature. This places the concept outside science entirely, in the realm of pure speculation or faith. Third, the teleological assumption that history has a goal contradicts modern scientific understanding. Evolution has no direction or purpose. It simply reflects differential survival and reproduction. The universe does not care about complexity, consciousness, or humanity. Local increases in organization occur through natural processes but are balanced by entropy elsewhere. There is no cosmic telos drawing everything toward fulfillment. Fourth, the evidence McKenna cited from psychedelic experiences is entirely subjective. The feeling of encountering a transcendent presence during a trip reflects brain states induced by drugs, not objective reality. That many people report similar feelings shows that psychedelics produce consistent effects on human neurology, not that they reveal actual metaphysical truths. The sense of meaning, purpose, and presence is generated by the brain, not discovered in external reality. Physicists and philosophers of time find McKenna's temporal paradoxes incoherent rather than profound. Time is a dimension of space-time, not a river flowing toward a destination. Events occur when they occur. There is no future object exerting attraction. While humans can be motivated by future goals they imagine, this psychological fact does not make the future causally prior to the present. McKenna confused subjective teleology with objective reality. The comparison to Teilhard's omega point is instructive because Teilhard faced similar criticisms from scientists. Teilhard was a legitimate paleontologist, but his omega point theory was theological speculation grafted onto evolutionary biology. Modern evolutionary scientists reject the idea that evolution tends toward increasing consciousness or complexity. Many evolutionary lineages become simpler, and consciousness is a peculiarity of some animal lineages, not a universal tendency. Religious and mystical traditions that McKenna drew from offer their own critiques. Buddhist philosophy, for instance, would view the transcendental object as another conceptual construct to be transcended rather than a genuine ultimate reality. The object still exists within the framework of subject and object, knower and known, which meditation aims to dissolve entirely. Christian theologians would distinguish carefully between eschatological hope, grounded in revelation and mystical speculation about cosmic evolution. Even within psychedelic communities, many experienced users do not share McKenna's interpretation of the phenomena he described. They report encountering similar entities and presences, but understand them as aspects of psyche rather than transcendent realities. The feeling of imminent transformation and historical culmination can be understood as a common feature of altered states without requiring belief in actual metaphysical objects. The failure of McKenna's time-frame predictions undermines the concept further. If the transcendental object was indeed attracting history toward manifestation in 2012, something dramatic should have occurred. That nothing did suggests either the entire framework is wrong or requires such extensive post hoc rationalization that it loses all explanatory power. Yet the transcendental object idea resonates deeply with many people because it addresses genuine existential concerns. Modern life often feels meaningless, directionless, and arbitrary. The scientific worldview, while empirically powerful, can seem cold and purposeless. McKenna offered an alternative vision where history has meaning, consciousness matters cosmically, and human existence participates in something transcendent. This vision provides comfort and motivation, even if it is not literally true. The concept also captures something about the phenomenology of psychedelic experiences that purely neurological explanations miss. These states genuinely feel like encounters with otherness, intelligence, and transcendence. The sense that reality is far stranger and more meaningful than ordinary perception suggests is consistent and profound. Whether this feeling reflects truth or powerful illusion remains debatable, but dismissing the experiences entirely seems inadequate. Some philosophers argue that McKenna's transcendental object functions better as regulative idea than constitutive reality. That is, it does not describe an actual object, but provides a useful fiction for organizing experience and action. Treating the future as calling us forward, acting as if history has meaning, orienting toward transcendence, these can be valuable attitudes, even if metaphysically unfounded. The object functions as myth rather than fact. Contemporary work in cosmology and physics sometimes touches on ideas that superficially resemble aspects of McKenna's vision. Discussions of cosmological fine-tuning, the apparent directionality of time, the hard problem of consciousness, and the possibility of simulation theory all involve mysteries that keep metaphysical speculation alive. While none of these provide support for the transcendental object specifically, they show that reality remains far stranger than common sense suggests. Part 7. Shamanism, Indigenous Knowledge, and Ethnobotany. McKenna's work in ethnobotany and his championing of shamanic knowledge represent perhaps his most substantive and lasting contributions. Unlike his more speculative theories, his research into plant medicines and indigenous practices involved actual field work, botanical study, and serious engagement with anthropological literature. This dimension of his work earned respect even from critics who dismissed his cosmological speculations. Ethnobotany is the scientific study of how human cultures use and understand plants. McKenna approached this field with particular interest in psychoactive plants, which indigenous cultures have used for thousands of years in ritual, healing, and spiritual contexts. He travelled extensively through the Amazon basin, studying ayahuasca practices among various indigenous groups and collecting botanical specimens. This fieldwork grounded his theoretical work and gave him direct knowledge that most philosophers of consciousness lack. His best-known work in this area was with psilocybin containing mushrooms. Together with his brother Dennis, he wrote Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, under the pseudonym O.T. Oss and O.N. Ulrich in 1976. This book provided detailed instructions for cultivating psilocybin mushrooms using accessible materials and techniques. The publication democratized access to these mushrooms and contributed to their widespread availability. McKenna argued forcefully that indigenous shamanic practices represented sophisticated knowledge systems deserving scientific respect. When a shaman uses ayahuasca to diagnose illness, identify plants, or gain information, they are employing a technology as legitimate as any scientific instrument. The fact that Western science cannot explain how this works should prompt investigation rather than dismissal. Indigenous peoples have discovered therapeutic compounds through shamanic means that Western pharmacology later validated. He documented numerous examples where shamanic knowledge anticipated scientific discovery. Indigenous Amazonians knew that combining DMT-containing plants with MAO inhibitor plants would produce powerful visionary effects, a combination that requires sophisticated chemical understanding. They used various plants for treating specific ailments in ways that modern pharmacology has confirmed. They recognized psychoactive properties of numerous species that Western botany had classified as inert. McKenna's ethnobotanical work emphasized the fragility and urgency of preserving indigenous knowledge. As rainforests are destroyed and indigenous cultures assimilate or disappear, humanity loses irreplaceable information about the natural world. Shamans spend lifetimes learning about thousands of plant species and their properties. When a shaman dies without transmitting this knowledge, it is like burning a library. He advocated strongly for protecting indigenous territories and supporting cultural continuity. He distinguished carefully between authentic shamanic practices and Western appropriations or distortions. True shamanism involves years of training, cultural transmission, and deep relationship with specific places and plants. Weekend workshops claiming to teach shamanic techniques often commercialize and trivialize genuine traditions. McKenna criticized New Age practitioners who adopted superficial shamanic trappings without understanding the cultural context and serious commitments involved. At the same time, McKenna believed Western people could learn from and engage with shamanic practices respectfully. He advocated what he called psychedelic shamanism, where individuals use these substances for self-exploration and healing outside traditional contexts. This required approaching the plants with respect and intention, rather than as mere recreational drugs. It meant acknowledging their power and the knowledge traditions they emerge from. McKenna's ethnobotanical research contributed to growing scientific and medical interest in plant medicines. His writings helped establish ayahuasca, psilocybin, and DMT as subjects worthy of serious study rather than mere curiosities or dangers. He provided detailed phenomenological accounts that researchers could reference. He connected different traditions, showing common patterns across cultures. He articulated why these substances might have therapeutic value. His work also highlighted the political dimensions of plant medicine research. The criminalization of psychoactive plants represented, in McKenna's view, a form of cultural imperialism, where Western legal systems overrode indigenous practices and knowledge. It prevented scientific research that could benefit millions. It criminalized forms of spiritual practice and healing that had sustained cultures for millennia. He advocated vigorously for religious and personal freedom regarding plant medicines. However, McKenna's ethnobotanical work was not without problems. First, he sometimes romanticized indigenous cultures and shamanic practices, presenting them as uniformly wise and beneficial, while downplaying their own forms of exploitation, hierarchy, and harm. Shamans can be charlatans, abusive, or simply mistaken. Not all indigenous plant knowledge is accurate or safe. The existence of traditional use does not automatically validate efficacy or safety. Second, his advocacy for personal psychedelic shamanism raised concerns about safety and mental health. Not everyone can use these substances safely. People with certain psychiatric conditions, those taking specific medications, and those without adequate support and preparation can experience serious adverse effects. By promoting high-dose solo experiences, McKenna may have encouraged practices that put vulnerable individuals at risk. Third, anthropologists note that McKenna's understanding of shamanism was selective and influenced by his own experiences and biases. He emphasized visionary and consciousness-focused aspects while paying less attention to the social functions, political dimensions, and mundane aspects of shamanic practice. He sometimes projected his own psychedelic phenomenology onto indigenous experiences that might have been quite different. Fourth, his claim that shamanic knowledge systems are equivalent to science overstates the case. Shamanic traditions have discovered valuable information about plants and their effects, but they also include false beliefs, superstitions, and explanations that contradict what we know about biology and chemistry. The knowledge is pragmatic and often effective, but not systematically reliable in the way scientific knowledge strives to be. Fifth, botanists and chemists note that McKenna sometimes made claims about plants and compounds that were not well supported by research. His enthusiasm occasionally led him to accept anecdotal reports or traditional claims without sufficient skepticism. While he was usually careful to distinguish speculation from established fact, his rhetorical style sometimes blurred these boundaries. The commercialization and popularization of ayahuasca and other indigenous medicines raises complex ethical issues that McKenna did not fully address. As these practices spread globally, they create markets that can exploit indigenous communities, damage ecosystems through overharvesting, and dilute authentic traditions. The question of cultural appropriation versus cultural sharing remains contentious. Contemporary research has validated many of McKenna's claims about the therapeutic potential of plant medicines. Clinical trials show psilocybin effectively treats depression, anxiety, addiction, and PTSD. Ayahuasca research demonstrates neuroplastic effects and mental health benefits. DMT studies reveal fascinating effects on brain networks and consciousness. This vindication has led to McKenna being recognized as a visionary who advocated for research that mainstream science is only now conducting. However, this research also reveals the complexity that McKenna's binary framing of shamanic knowledge versus Western science obscures. The most effective therapeutic use of psychedelics combines indigenous wisdom about set and setting with rigorous scientific methodology for measuring outcomes and ensuring safety. Neither tradition alone is sufficient. The synthesis of approaches proves most valuable. McKenna's ethnobotanical legacy includes his massive library of recorded lectures and writings documenting his experiences and knowledge. These archives preserve his observations about various plants, cultures and practices. Researchers continue to reference his work when studying the history of psychedelic use and the transmission of indigenous knowledge to Western audiences. His emphasis on the importance of set and setting for psychedelic experiences has become foundational in contemporary research and therapy. The recognition that these substances are not mere chemicals producing fixed effects, but tools whose outcomes depend critically on context, derives partly from indigenous wisdom that McKenna helped transmit. Modern clinical trials carefully design environments and provide psychological support based on principles that shamanic traditions recognized long ago. The tension in McKenna's work between advocacy and scholarship represents a continuing challenge for anyone working in this area. He was not a neutral observer, but a passionate advocate who believed plant medicines could transform individual and collective consciousness. This passion fueled important work, but also compromised objectivity. Finding the balance between respecting indigenous knowledge and subjecting claims to critical evaluation remains difficult. McKenna's ethnobotanical contributions are most valuable when separated from his more speculative theories. The careful documentation of plant uses, the phenomenological descriptions of effects, the cultural contexts of practices, these constitute genuine scholarly contributions. The cosmological interpretations he built on these foundations, while provocative, stand on shakier ground. Future researchers can build on his ethnobotanical work while remaining agnostic about his metaphysical claims. Part 8. Technology, Virtual Reality, and the Cybernetic Future. McKenna's vision of technology and the future combined enthusiasm with profound concern. Unlike many psychedelic advocates who rejected technology as alienating and destructive, McKenna saw technological development as potentially complementary to psychedelic exploration. He believed that technologies like virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and global communications networks could help realize the transformations that psychedelics prefigured. This position emerged partly from his cultural context. McKenna came of age during the 1960s counterculture, but matured intellectually during the personal computer revolution of the 1980s and 90s. He recognized that computers and networks offered unprecedented tools for consciousness exploration, community building, and reality manipulation. While many of his peers in the psychedelic community remained technophobic, McKenna embraced digital culture. Virtual reality held particular fascination for McKenna. He saw VR as potentially creating shared experiential spaces similar to what he encountered in psychedelic states. Instead of describing a DMT vision with inadequate words, one could build a virtual environment that others could enter and explore. This would enable new forms of communication, transcending the limitations of language. People could share imaginal spaces directly rather than translating them into symbols. He compared virtual reality to a culturally sanctioned, technologically mediated equivalent of the visionary realms accessed through psychedelics. Society that criminalized DMT might accept VR because it seemed safer and more controllable. But if VR technology became sufficiently advanced, the distinction between drug-induced visions and computer-generated realities might dissolve. Both involved consciousness encountering constructed worlds that felt real despite being somehow artificial or other. McKenna anticipated contemporary developments in several areas. He foresaw the Internet enabling new forms of community and information sharing that would challenge hierarchical control structures. He predicted that as computational power increased, we would create increasingly sophisticated simulations and artificial realities. He recognized that the boundary between human and machine consciousness would become increasingly problematic as artificial intelligence advanced. His concept of the human-machine symbiosis proposed that technology was not external to human nature, but represented its natural extension. Tools and technologies have always been integral to what humans are and do. Language is a technology, as is writing, agriculture, and mathematics. Each expanded human capacities in ways that transformed consciousness itself. Digital technologies represent the latest phase in this ongoing co-evolution. McKenna drew connections between his ideas about psychedelics as instruments for exploring consciousness and computers as instruments for extending cognition. Both were tools that enabled humans to see and do things otherwise impossible. Both created new domains of experience that felt separate from ordinary reality, but were somehow continuous with it. Both raised questions about what is real, what is simulation, and how consciousness relates to material substrates. He was particularly interested in what he called visible language technologies. These would allow thoughts and feelings to be directly displayed as visual or sensory forms that others could experience. This recalled his descriptions of communication with entities in DMT space, where meaning appeared as tangible structure. Technologies enabling direct consciousness-to-consciousness communication without linguistic mediation would represent, in his view, a revolutionary advance comparable to the invention of speech itself. McKenna also explored the concept of nanotechnology and its implications for consciousness. He speculated that as we gained ability to manipulate matter at molecular and atomic scales, we could create new forms of intelligence and new substrates for consciousness. The distinction between biological and artificial, organic and synthetic, living and non-living would collapse. This opened possibilities for consciousness migration, enhancement and transformation that psychedelics had hinted at, but could not fully deliver. At the same time, McKenna expressed concerns about technology's potential for increased control and surveillance. The same networks that enabled freedom of information could enable totalitarian monitoring. Virtual realities could become addictive escape mechanisms, preventing engagement with actual reality. Artificial intelligence might develop in ways contrary to human values and interests. Technology without wisdom, he warned, could accelerate civilization toward catastrophe rather than transcendence. He saw psychedelics as necessary complements to technology precisely because they provided experiences of dissolution, chaos, and confrontation with the unpredictable. Technology tends toward order, control, and predictability. Psychedelics inject wildness, strangeness, and humility. The combination of technological power and psychedelic wisdom might enable humanity to navigate transformations that either alone would botch. McKenna anticipated debates about simulation theory, the hypothesis that our reality might itself be a simulation running on some advanced civilization's computers. He noted that psychedelic experiences already raise questions about the solidity and nature of reality. If consciousness can enter seemingly real alternative worlds through molecules or potentially through technology, what guarantees that ordinary reality is not also a construction of some kind? While he did not commit to simulation theory, he found it philosophically interesting and consistent with his other ideas. His vision of the cybernetic future included radical transformations of human embodiment and identity. He speculated about uploaded consciousness, where individual minds might be transferred to computational substrates and freed from biological limitations. He imagined designer bodies and multiple simultaneous incarnations. He envisioned humans merging with AI to create hybrid intelligences. These ideas, once purely science-fictional, have become serious topics in transhumanist philosophy and AI safety research. McKenna distinguished his technologically embracing position from naive techno-utopianism. He did not believe technology automatically led to progress or that every innovation was beneficial. He recognized that technologies could be used for domination and destruction as easily as for liberation and creativity. The question was not whether to develop technology, which seemed inevitable, but how to guide technological development toward humane and consciousness-expanding ends. Critics from various angles challenge McKenna's technological vision. Many in the environmentalist and back-to-the-land movements see his embrace of technology as betraying core values of the psychedelic experience, particularly the reverence for nature and the critique of industrial civilization. If psychedelics teach us that nature is sacred and that we need to live more simply, how can we simultaneously pursue high-technology futures that require massive resource extraction and energy consumption? Philosophers concerned with technology point out that McKenna underestimated the ways technology shapes consciousness in problematic directions. Social media and digital devices have increased anxiety, shortened attention spans, and created new forms of addiction and social control. Virtual reality could deepen alienation from embodied existence and natural world. The promise that technology would liberate consciousness has not been realized in ways McKenna hoped. Computer scientists and AI researchers note that McKenna's vision of human-machine merger underestimates immense technical challenges. Consciousness uploading faces theoretical and practical obstacles that may be insurmountable. We do not understand consciousness well enough to know if it could be substrate independent. The brain is not a computer, and mental processes may depend essentially on biological properties that cannot be replicated in silicon. Ethicists worry about the implications of technologies McKenna celebrated. Powerful virtual realities could enable unprecedented manipulation and exploitation. Brain-computer interfaces raise profound questions about privacy, autonomy, and identity. Artificial intelligence presents existential risks that McKenna acknowledged but did not fully reckon with. Enthusiasm for technological transformation needs to be tempered by careful consideration of what might be lost and what new harms might emerge. McKenna's prediction that technology and psychedelics would converge remains only partially realized. While neuroscience uses advanced technology to study psychedelic effects, and while some researchers explore combinations of VR and psychedelics, we have not achieved the synthesis McKenna imagined. Most technology development proceeds without psychedelic influence, and most psychedelic use happens independently of advanced technology. The visible language technologies he anticipated have not materialized and may not be possible. Communication between minds still requires symbolic mediation through language or images. We cannot yet share experiences directly or enter each other's imaginal spaces, except metaphorically. The DMT communication style remains locked within individual psychedelic experiences rather than becoming technologically reproducible. However, aspects of McKenna's vision have been realized in unexpected ways. The Internet enables global information sharing and community formation he anticipated. Virtual and augmented reality technologies create increasingly convincing alternative realities. Brain imaging allows us to see neural correlates of consciousness in real time. Brain-computer interfaces enable direct communication between brains and machines. Each development raises questions about reality, consciousness, and identity that McKenna grappled with. Contemporary debates about social media, AI safety, and technological existential risk echo concerns McKenna voiced. His warning that technology without wisdom could lead to catastrophe seems increasingly prescient as we confront challenges of misinformation, automated warfare, and potential AI misalignment. His call for psychedelic-influenced wisdom to guide technological development remains relevant even if we lack clear methods for achieving such guidance. The value of McKenna's technological vision lies not in its predictive accuracy, but in its refusal of false dichotomies. He showed that one could take psychedelics seriously while also taking technology seriously. He demonstrated that consciousness exploration and technological development need not be opposed. He imagined futures that synthesize seemingly contradictory values and approaches. Whether his specific synthesis was correct matters less than his demonstration that synthesis is possible and worth pursuing. Part 9. Alchemy, Hermeticism, and Western Esoteric Traditions. McKenna's relationship with Western esoteric traditions was complex and often overlooked in discussions of his work. While he is primarily known for championing Indigenous shamanism and Eastern mysticism, he also drew extensively from alchemy, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and other Western occult traditions. This dimension of his thought reveals how he attempted to synthesize global wisdom traditions into a unified vision of consciousness and reality. Alchemy particularly fascinated McKenna because it represented Western culture's suppressed mystical tradition. He argued that alchemy was never primarily about transmuting lead into gold, but about transforming consciousness. The alchemical laboratory was a space for experimentation with both matter and mind, where chemical operations mirrored psychological and spiritual transformations. The cryptic symbolic language of alchemical texts concealed knowledge about altered states and inner processes. McKenna interpreted alchemical imagery through his psychedelic lens. The philosopher's stone, the goal of alchemical work, represented the psychedelic experience itself, or the state of consciousness it revealed. The various stages of the alchemical process, nigredo or blackening, albedo or whitening, and rubedo or reddening, corresponded to phases of psychedelic journeys. The Hermetic maxim, as above, so below, suggested that patterns in consciousness mirror patterns in cosmos, exactly what McKenna believed psychedelics revealed. He pointed to historical evidence that many alchemists actually worked with psychoactive substances. Medieval and Renaissance alchemical laboratories would have contained various plant extracts and mineral preparations with consciousness-altering properties. The secrecy surrounding alchemical work may have concealed not just protochemistry, but also experimentation with forbidden consciousness technologies. McKenna suggested that the persecution of alchemists paralleled later persecution of psychedelic users. The Hermetic tradition, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, provided McKenna with frameworks for understanding consciousness and cosmos as unified. Hermetic philosophy proposed that mind is primary and matter secondary, that consciousness pervades the universe, and that humans participate in divine creativity. These ideas aligned perfectly with McKenna's psychedelic gnosis that consciousness is fundamental and material reality derivative or constructed. Gnosticism appealed to McKenna for its emphasis on direct spiritual knowledge over faith or dogma. Gnostic texts describe a cosmos where material reality represents imprisonment of divine consciousness, and liberation comes through experiential knowledge rather than belief. McKenna interpreted this as describing the predicament psychedelics reveal, that ordinary consciousness is trapped in limited perception, and certain experiences can free it to recognize its true nature. He drew connections between Gnostic cosmology and his own ideas about reality. The Gnostic demiurge, the false god who created the material world as prison for consciousness, paralleled McKenna's concept of culture as reality construction that limits experience. The Gnostic aeons, emanations from the true divine source, resembled the dimensional entities encountered in deep psychedelic states. The Gnostic emphasis on hidden wisdom transmitted through initiatory experience matched the esoteric knowledge psychedelics seemed to reveal. McKenna also engaged with Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition involving complex symbolic systems mapping consciousness and reality. The Kabbalistic tree of life, with its 10 Sephiroth, provided a framework for understanding different dimensions or levels of being. The idea that reality manifests through successive emanations from divine unity resonated with McKenna's sense that multiple realities nest within each other, accessible through altered states. The Western magical tradition, as transmitted through figures like Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn, interested McKenna for its practical techniques of consciousness manipulation. Ceremonial magic involved elaborate rituals designed to induce altered states and contact non-ordinary entities. While McKenna viewed psychedelics as more direct and reliable than magical procedures, he recognized both as technologies for the same purpose, expanding and directing consciousness beyond ordinary limits. He interpreted the history of Western esotericism as a suppressed underground stream of consciousness exploration running parallel to mainstream culture. While official Christianity promoted faith and obedience, esoteric Christians pursued direct mystical experience. While Enlightenment science championed rationalism, occultists explored subjective dimensions. This underground tradition preserved knowledge about consciousness that mainstream culture rejected, similar to how Indigenous shamanism preserved psychedelic knowledge. McKenna believed that Jung's depth psychology represented a partial recovery of this esoteric knowledge in modern form. Jung's concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and individuation process translated esoteric ideas into psychological language. Jung's own experiments with active imagination and possibly with psychedelics showed him exploring consciousness in ways that esoteric traditions had long practiced. McKenna saw his own work as continuing this project of recovering suppressed Western wisdom. He also connected Western esotericism to his ideas about the transcendental object and novelty. Many esoteric traditions are teleological, proposing that history moves toward some culmination or revelation. Christian eschatology anticipates the second coming. Alchemists sought the perfected stone. Kabbalists spoke of cosmic restoration or tikkun. These traditions share with McKenna the sense that time is not meaningless succession, but movement toward transformation. However, McKenna's engagement with Western esotericism faced significant problems. First, his interpretations were often highly selective, emphasizing aspects that fit his psychedelic paradigm while ignoring contrary elements. Alchemy included genuinely chemical work alongside symbolism, and most alchemists pursued material gold as well as spiritual transformation. Reducing alchemy to psychedelic metaphor oversimplifies a complex historical phenomenon. Second, scholars of Western esotericism note that McKenna's historical claims about alchemists using psychedelics lack strong evidence. While some plant and mineral preparations used by alchemists may have had psychoactive properties, we have little documentation of systematic psychedelic use. The symbolic language of alchemy does not necessarily conceal drug experiences, but may encode other kinds of knowledge or simply be genuinely symbolic without hidden literal meaning. Third, McKenna's conflation of diverse esoteric traditions into a single suppressed wisdom stream ignores important differences and developments. Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, and alchemy emerged in different cultural contexts with different concerns. They influence each other but remain distinct traditions with incompatible elements. Treating them as variations on a single theme imposes artificial unity. Fourth, religious studies, scholars point out that McKenna's reading of Gnosticism as proto-psychedelic philosophy distorts these traditions. Gnostic texts describe a metaphysical cosmology and soteriology that cannot be reduced to altered states of consciousness. While some Gnostics may have used consciousness-altering techniques, their primary concern was theological understanding of evil, matter, and salvation. Psychedelics provide one possible interpretive lens, but not the only or best one. Fifth, historians of science caution against romanticizing the relationship between esotericism and science. While some early scientists like Newton engaged with alchemy, the development of modern science involved explicitly rejecting esoteric approaches in favor of public, replicable, empirical methods. The occult traditions McKenna championed are epistemologically opposed to scientific methodology rather than representing suppressed scientific knowledge. Jung scholars note that while Jung explored various esoteric traditions, he did not simply endorse them, but used them as sources of symbolic material for psychological interpretation. Jung's collective unconscious and archetypes are psychological concepts, not metaphysical realities. McKenna sometimes read Jung more literally and metaphysically than Jung intended, though Jung's own views on this remained ambiguous throughout his career. The magical tradition that McKenna engaged with, particularly through Crowley, has its own deeply problematic aspects that he largely ignored. Crowley was a complex figure whose work combined genuine occult scholarship with narcissism, misogyny, and ethical problems. Modern magical practitioners debate how to separate valuable techniques from harmful ideologies. McKenna's uncritical appropriation of magical concepts risks importing these problems. Contemporary scholars of Western esotericism have become more sophisticated about distinguishing historical reality from later constructions and myths. Many beliefs about ancient wisdom traditions, secret societies, and suppressed knowledge turn out to be relatively recent inventions or serious distortions of historical facts. The narrative of a perennial philosophy transmitted underground through the ages, which McKenna partially accepted, has been largely discredited by careful historical research. Yet McKenna's engagement with esotericism made important contributions despite these problems. He demonstrated that psychedelic phenomenology resonates with multiple wisdom traditions across cultures and times. He showed that Western culture has its own mystical resources beyond imported Eastern traditions. He encouraged serious study of texts and practices that mainstream academia had dismissed as mere superstition or fraud. His work helped spark renewed academic interest in Western esotericism as a field of study. Universities now offer courses and produce research on alchemy, Hermeticism and magic as serious historical phenomena worthy of scholarly attention. While academic esotericism, scholars generally disagree with McKenna's interpretations, they share his conviction that these traditions deserve study rather than dismissal. The psychological value of esoteric symbolism remains even when literal historical claims fail. Alchemical imagery can illuminate psychological processes regardless of whether alchemists literally use psychedelics. Kabbalistic structures can organize spiritual experience regardless of their historical origins. Gnostic mythology can articulate existential concerns regardless of its theological accuracy. McKenna understood that symbols work through resonance and meaning rather than literal truth. His synthesis of Eastern and Western, Indigenous and Esoteric, ancient and modern, created a unique spiritual bricolage that many people found compelling. While academically problematic, this syncretic approach reflected the reality of contemporary spirituality, where people freely combine elements from multiple traditions. McKenna modelled how to create personal meaning systems from diverse sources rather than accepting any single tradition as authoritative. The esoteric dimension of McKenna's work reveals his fundamentally mystical orientation. Beneath the ethnobotany and philosophy lay a quest for direct experience of transcendence and transformation. The various traditions he drew from, whether shamanic, psychedelic, esoteric, or technological, all served this underlying drive to exceed ordinary consciousness and contact something ultimate. Understanding this mystical core is essential for grasping what motivated his entire intellectual project. Part 10. The Nature of Reality, Dimensions and Hyperspace. McKenna's ontology, his theory of what exists and how reality is structured, represents perhaps his most radical departure from both scientific materialism and traditional philosophy. He proposed that reality consists of multiple dimensions or levels, only one of which is the ordinary physical world we normally inhabit. Other dimensions, which he called hyperspace, can be accessed through psychedelics and contain entities, information and possibilities that exceed anything in ordinary reality. The concept of hyperspace came directly from McKenna's psychedelic experiences, particularly with DMT. He reported that taking this substance felt like being launched into a completely different realm with its own coherent reality, laws and inhabitants. This was not merely hallucination or distorted perception of the familiar world, but entry into an autonomous dimension that existed independently. The term hyperspace suggested something beyond ordinary three-dimensional space, a realm of higher dimensionality. McKenna described hyperspace with remarkable consistency across many talks and writings. It appeared as a space filled with impossible geometries, self-transforming objects, and entities that seemed intelligent and purposeful. These entities, which he variously called machine elves, self-transforming elf machines or hyperdimensional entities actively communicated and demonstrated objects or ideas. The space itself was more real than ordinary reality, possessing a clarity, intensity and coherence that made normal perception seem vague by comparison. He distinguished between different kinds of psychedelic spaces. Psilocybin created a different realm than DMT, with different qualities and inhabitants. LSD opened yet another kind of space. Each psychedelic, in his phenomenology, granted access to specific dimensions with characteristic features. This suggested that multiple non-ordinary realities exist, and different substances served as keys to different doors. McKenna proposed that these dimensions are ontologically real rather than hallucinations. Just as radio waves exist whether or not we have receivers to detect them, hyperspace exists whether or not we have psychedelics to access it. The brain normally filters out perception of these dimensions because attending to them would interfere with survival in ordinary reality. Psychedelics temporarily remove these filters, allowing consciousness to perceive what is always there, but usually hidden. This theory connects to his ideas about consciousness and reality. McKenna argued that consciousness is more fundamental than matter, and that material reality represents one manifestation of consciousness rather than its source. If consciousness is primary, then the subjective dimensions accessed through psychedelics could be as real or more real than the objective physical world. The distinction between inside and outside, subjective and objective, breaks down when consciousness itself is ontologically basic. He drew analogies to physics to make his ideas seem scientifically plausible. Modern physics already accepts dimensions beyond the three spatial dimensions of everyday experience. String theory proposes 10 or 11 dimensions, most of them curled up at such small scales that we cannot directly perceive them. If physics can posit invisible dimensions to explain particle behavior, why couldn't psychedelics reveal additional dimensions relevant to consciousness? McKenna also referenced quantum mechanics and its implications for the nature of reality. The observer effect in quantum experiments shows that consciousness and measurement affect physical outcomes. The many worlds interpretation suggests that multiple realities exist simultaneously. Quantum entanglement demonstrates non-local connections that violate ordinary spatial constraints. These puzzling features of quantum reality suggested to McKenna that physics was catching up to what mysticism had long known, that reality is far stranger than common sense suggests. He proposed that the entities in hyperspace might be genuinely non-human intelligences rather than projections of the human psyche. They could be alien life forms, existing in dimensions we normally cannot access. They could be more advanced post-human descendants reaching back through time. They could be aspects of a universal consciousness that manifest as apparently autonomous beings. McKenna remained agnostic about their precise nature while insisting on their autonomy and intelligence. The implications for understanding reality were enormous. If hyperspace is real, then scientific materialism's picture of reality as consisting solely of matter and energy in space-time is radically incomplete. An entire domain of existence has been excluded from mainstream investigation. This would explain why purely materialist approaches to consciousness fail, because consciousness involves dimensions that materialism cannot acknowledge. McKenna connected his dimensional theory to ideas about information and meaning. He suggested that hyperspace might be a dimension where information exists in pure form before being encoded in physical structures. The Platonic realm of forms, the collective unconscious, the Akashic records of esoteric tradition, all might refer to this informational dimension that psychedelics reveal. When we have creative insights or intuitions, we may be accessing information from hyperspace. He also explored connections between his hyperspace concept and simulation theory. If our reality could be a simulation running on some advanced technology, that technology and its operators would exist in a higher dimensional reality relative to our simulated three-dimensional space. The entities encountered in hyperspace might be administrators, programmers, or even fellow explorers from the base reality who manifest in our simulation. While speculative, this framework made sense of otherwise inexplicable features of psychedelic phenomenology. However, McKenna's hyperspace ontology faces devastating objections from multiple directions. First, and most fundamentally, neuroscience provides compelling alternative explanations for psychedelic experiences that do not require positing other dimensions. Psychedelics work by binding to serotonin receptors and disrupting normal brain function, particularly in regions associated with the default mode network and sensory integration. The experiences they produce, however vivid and meaningful, result from altered neural processing rather than access to external realities. Second, the argument from analogy to physics is deeply flawed. The extra dimensions that string theory proposes are mathematical constructs inferred from equations, not experienced realities. They operate at scales trillions of times smaller than atoms and affect only fundamental particles, not consciousness or perception. Nothing in physics suggests that human consciousness can access additional spatial dimensions through drugs. McKenna was appropriating scientific terminology without scientific justification. Third, the claim that hyperspace entities are autonomous beings contradicts everything we know about how brains generate experience. When specific brain regions are stimulated, people report encounters with presences, hear voices, and feel watched. These are neural phenomena, not actual entities. The sense that something is conscious, intelligent, and other can be produced by brain processes without requiring actual external consciousness. Fourth, if hyperspace and its inhabitants were real, there should be ways to verify this independently of subjective reports. Different people should be able to gather information from hyperspace that could be cross-checked. Predictions based on hyperspace information should sometimes succeed beyond chance. None of this occurs. Psychedelic experiences are subjective and cannot be independently verified, exactly what we would expect if they were hallucinations rather than perceptions of real dimensions. Fifth, the consistency of psychedelic reports that McKenna cited actually supports the neurological explanation rather than the dimensional one. If similar brain disruptions produce similar experiences across different people, that is explained by shared neural architecture. We would expect different brains to respond similarly to the same pharmacological interventions. Consistency in subjective reports does not prove objective reality. Philosophers note that McKenna's argument conflates phenomenology with ontology. The fact that hyperspace feels real during the experience does not make it ontologically real. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming, but we do not conclude that dream worlds exist independently. Schizophrenia involves experiences of external voices and presences that feel absolutely real to the experiencer, but these are recognized as symptoms of illness rather than perceptions of actual entities. The invocation of quantum mechanics to support psychedelic metaphysics represents a common misuse of physics. Quantum effects operate at microscopic scales and are carefully isolated in laboratory conditions. The warm, wet environment of the brain is quantum decoherent, meaning quantum superposition collapses almost instantly. Nothing in quantum mechanics suggests that consciousness can directly affect macroscopic reality or access other dimensions through subjective experience. McKenna's claim that consciousness is more fundamental than matter reverses the scientific understanding without adequate justification. Everything we know about consciousness indicates it depends on and emerges from brain activity. Damage specific brain regions, and you lose specific conscious capacities. No evidence suggests consciousness can exist or operate independently of physical substrates. The correlation between brain states and conscious states is so tight that materialism remains the most parsimonious explanation. The comparison of psychedelics to scientific instruments that detect otherwise invisible phenomena is also problematic. Telescopes and microscopes allow multiple observers to see the same things and measure them consistently. Their results can be calibrated and verified. Psychedelics do not work this way. They produce private, subjective experiences that vary between individuals and cannot be independently confirmed. They are more like dreams than telescopes. Contemporary researchers studying psychedelics generally interpret the experiences within a neuroscientific framework. The sense of accessing other dimensions reflects how the brain constructs reality when normal constraints are removed. The entities encountered represent aspects of self that appear as other when usual integrative processes are disrupted. The profound insights and revelations have therapeutic value, but do not provide information about objective reality beyond the individual psyche. Yet something important remains in McKenna's phenomenology, even if his ontology is wrong. The psychedelic experience genuinely challenges our assumptions about the nature of mind and reality. It reveals that consciousness is far more plastic and capable than we normally realize. It demonstrates that our ordinary perception of reality is constructed through complex neural processes rather than being a direct, transparent window onto objective truth. These insights remain valuable even within a materialist framework. The sense of encountering autonomous intelligence in psychedelic states also deserves explanation, even if we reject literal interpretation. Why does the brain construct experiences of other minds, rather than merely producing visual distortions or emotional changes? What does this reveal about how consciousness models agency and intentionality? These questions remain interesting regardless of whether hyperspace exists. Some philosophers argue that strict materialism may be too restrictive, and that consciousness poses genuine explanatory problems that current neuroscience cannot fully address. The hard problem of consciousness, why subjective experience exists at all, remains unsolved. While this does not justify McKenna's dimensional ontology, it suggests that reality may be more mysterious than simple materialism allows. Alternative frameworks like panpsychism or neutral monism deserve consideration. The value of McKenna's hyperspace cosmology may lie more in its function as existential poetry than as literal metaphysics. It expresses the genuine strangeness and wonder of psychedelic phenomenology. It captures the feeling that these experiences reveal something important about reality and consciousness. It provides a framework for integrating and making meaning from encounters that resist easy explanation. As myth and metaphor, hyperspace works even if, as physics, it fails. Part 11. McKenna's relationship with science and academia. McKenna's relationship with institutional science and academia was characterized by mutual suspicion and missed opportunities. He positioned himself as an outsider challenging orthodoxy, while scientists viewed him as a charismatic but undisciplined thinker, making extraordinary claims without adequate evidence. This dynamic shaped both how his work was received and how it should be evaluated. McKenna did not follow a conventional academic path. He studied ecology and resource conservation at the University of California, Berkeley, but did not complete a doctorate or pursue an academic career. Instead, he conducted independent fieldwork, read widely across disciplines, and developed his ideas outside institutional structures. This independence gave him freedom to pursue unconventional lines of inquiry, but also meant his work lacked the rigor that academic training and peer review provide. His background in ethnobotany gave him legitimate scientific credentials in one narrow domain. He knew plant taxonomy, chemistry, and the anthropological literature on indigenous plant use. His fieldwork in the Amazon and his documentation of psychoactive plants contributed to scientific knowledge. Researchers studying ayahuasca and other plant medicines cite his work when discussing traditional uses and preparation methods. However, McKenna's broader theoretical claims about evolution, consciousness, time, and reality fell outside his area of expertise. He was not trained in evolutionary biology, neuroscience, physics, or philosophy of mind. When he made claims in these areas, he did so as an educated amateur rather than as a specialist. This did not automatically invalidate his ideas, but it meant they required especially careful scrutiny and expert evaluation. McKenna was acutely aware of his outsider status and often framed it as an advantage. He argued that conventional academic training produced conformity and discouraged radical thinking. Scientists invested in materialist paradigms could not recognize evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Independent thinkers, freed from institutional constraints, could see connections and possibilities that specialists missed. This self-presentation appealed to countercultural audiences who distrusted academic authority. He developed a sophisticated critique of scientific methodology as applied to consciousness. Science requires public, repeatable observations that multiple investigators can verify. But consciousness is inherently private and subjective. The most profound aspects of conscious experience resist quantification and third-person observation. Therefore, McKenna argued, science as currently practiced cannot adequately investigate consciousness, and we need new methodologies that take first-person experience seriously. This epistemological challenge to scientific authority resonated with movements in philosophy of mind and consciousness studies. Phenomenology, the philosophical study of conscious experience from the first-person perspective, had long argued that reducing consciousness to physical processes missed something essential. Neurophenomenology, developed by Francisco Varela and others, attempted to integrate first-person and third-person approaches. McKenna aligned himself with these efforts to expand scientific methodology. However, McKenna's relationship with academic consciousness studies remained marginal. While some researchers found his phenomenological reports interesting, most dismissed his metaphysical interpretations as unscientific speculation. His insistence that psychedelic experiences revealed objective truths about reality rather than merely interesting brain states put him at odds with the neurological framework most scientists used. McKenna made several specific claims that could be tested scientifically, and scientists have tested them with mostly negative results. His Stoned Ape Theory lacked archaeological and genetic evidence and was rejected by anthropologists. His Timewave Zero predictions failed when 2012 passed without the predicted transformation. His claims about visual acuity enhancement from low-dose psilocybin were not consistently replicated in controlled studies. These failures undermined his credibility with the scientific community. At the same time, some of McKenna's intuitions have been vindicated by subsequent research. He argued for decades that psychedelics had therapeutic potential that science was ignoring. Contemporary clinical trials have confirmed that psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychedelics can effectively treat depression, PTSD, addiction, and end-of-life anxiety. He emphasized the importance of set and setting, which is now recognized as crucial for therapeutic outcomes. He predicted that neuroscience would find psychedelics fascinating for understanding consciousness, which has proven true. McKenna's lectures at institutions like Esalen and the California Institute of Integral Studies gave him academic-adjacent platforms without requiring peer review. These venues attracted audiences interested in transformative ideas who valued provocation over proof. This environment allowed McKenna to develop his thinking without the constraints of academic culture, but also without its quality control mechanisms. His writing style, while engaging and eloquent, did not conform to academic standards. He made sweeping claims without systematic evidence, drew connections between disparate phenomena without rigorous argumentation, and relied heavily on personal experience and intuition. Academic readers found this frustrating, even when they agreed with some of his points. Popular readers found it liberating compared to dry academic prose. McKenna's relationship with specific scientists varied. Some, like Dennis McKenna, his brother, who did pursue an academic career in pharmacology, engaged seriously with his ideas while disagreeing with many conclusions. Others, like neuropsychopharmacologist David Nichols, respected his ethnobotanical work while dismissing his cosmological speculations. Still others viewed him as a dangerous popularizer, spreading misinformation about drugs. The scientific community's general dismissal of McKenna reflected both legitimate concerns and unjustified prejudice. Some scientists rejected his work based on careful evaluation of his claims and methods. Others dismissed him without serious engagement because he was associated with drug culture and lacked conventional credentials. The taboo against psychedelics in mainstream science meant that even researchers who might have found his phenomenological reports interesting avoided association with him. McKenna reciprocated this suspicion, viewing mainstream science as ideologically committed to materialism and hostile to consciousness. He saw the rejection of psychedelic research as evidence that science defended its paradigm rather than following evidence wherever it led. This attitude created a self-fulfilling prophecy where McKenna expected rejection and scientists expected pseudoscience, making productive dialogue difficult. The changing legal and cultural status of psychedelics has somewhat rehabilitated McKenna's reputation. As universities establish psychedelic research centers and prestigious journals publish studies on these substances, ideas McKenna promoted are taken more seriously. Researchers acknowledge his role in keeping interest alive during decades when all psychedelic research was banned. His archives of lectures provide valuable phenomenological data. However, contemporary psychedelic scientists carefully distance themselves from McKenna's more speculative claims. They emphasize that research is rigorously controlled, focused on measurable therapeutic outcomes, and conducted within established scientific frameworks. They do not talk about entities in hyperspace, consciousness as fundamental reality, or cosmic evolution toward transcendence. This allows them to pursue research that McKenna pioneered while avoiding the stigma his more radical ideas carry. The question of whether McKenna should be considered a scientist remains contentious. He conducted fieldwork, made observations, proposed hypotheses, and encouraged testing of predictions. These are elements of scientific practice. But he also made unfalsifiable claims, relied on mystical intuition, and rejected criticism from actual experts. He was perhaps better understood as a natural philosopher in the older sense, pursuing knowledge about nature through multiple approaches, including but not limited to scientific methodology. McKenna's critique of scientific method as inadequate for studying consciousness raises important issues that philosophy of mind still grapples with. The hard problem of consciousness, the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience, suggests that current scientific approaches may indeed be insufficient. Whether this requires expanding science to include first-person methodologies or accepting limits to scientific explanation remains debated. His emphasis on phenomenology and first-person experience contributed to growing recognition that consciousness science needs to take subjective reports seriously. While this does not validate his metaphysical interpretations, it supports the methodological point that you cannot study consciousness purely from the outside. Contemporary neuroscience increasingly incorporates detailed phenomenological reports alongside brain imaging and other objective measures. The legacy of McKenna's relationship with science is mixed. He helped maintain interest in psychedelics when mainstream science rejected them, contributing to the current research renaissance. He articulated important critiques of scientific materialism and reductionism. He demonstrated how independent scholarship could generate provocative ideas. But he also exemplified the dangers of intellectual work without peer review, showing how charisma and eloquence can spread ideas that do not withstand scrutiny. What scientists and scholars can learn from McKenna is the value of phenomenological richness and the importance of taking subjective experience seriously while also maintaining rigorous standards for truth claims. The psychedelic experience is genuinely mysterious and profound, deserving careful study. But mystery does not license any explanation, and profundity does not guarantee accuracy. The challenge is holding both openness and skepticism simultaneously, which McKenna himself struggled to do. Part 12. Major Critiques, Failures and Scholarly Debates. Any comprehensive analysis of McKenna's work must address its failures, contradictions, and the serious critiques it has provoked. While he made important contributions, much of his theoretical edifice does not withstand careful scrutiny. Understanding where and why his ideas fail is as important as recognizing their value. The most fundamental critique addresses McKenna's epistemology, his theory of how we know what we know. He argued that psychedelic experiences provide direct access to truth about consciousness and reality. But philosophers point out that experiences, however vivid or meaningful, can't validate themselves. We need independent methods to determine whether experiences correspond to reality or merely feel significant. McKenna rejected this requirement, essentially claiming that properly conducted psychedelic experiences are self-validating. This creates an unfalsifiable system where any skepticism can be dismissed as reflecting insufficient experience or openness. If someone takes psychedelics and does not encounter entities, McKenna could say they did not take enough or lacked proper preparation. If they encounter entities but interpret them as psychological rather than metaphysical, he could claim they were in denial or trapped in materialist thinking. This is classic pseudoscientific reasoning where the theory is protected from any possible refutation. The Stoned Ape Theory exemplifies how McKenna would develop compelling narratives without adequate evidence. Despite its popularity, the theory has been thoroughly rejected by experts in human evolution. No archaeological evidence supports regular mushroom consumption by early hominids. The proposed mechanism lacks biological plausibility. The timeline does not align with what we know about brain evolution. Yet McKenna continued promoting this theory for decades, apparently undeterred by expert criticism. Timewave Zero represents perhaps McKenna's greatest intellectual failure. He invested enormous effort developing this theory, creating software, giving lectures about it, and tying his credibility to specific predictions. When December 21, 2012 arrived without any transcendental event, the theory was conclusively falsified. Rather than acknowledging this failure, many of McKenna's followers simply reinterpreted what the prediction meant, claiming something did happen at a spiritual level, or that the timeline was symbolic rather than literal. This post hoc rationalization illustrates a broader problem with McKenna's work, the tendency to retreat into unfalsifiability when specific claims fail. If precise predictions are wrong, they become metaphorical. If entities cannot be proven real, they become archetypes. If historical claims lack evidence, they become mythopoetic truths. This flexibility protects the worldview, but at the cost of making it epistemically worthless. McKenna's treatment of indigenous cultures and shamanism has been criticized by anthropologists as romanticized and selective. He presented shamanic traditions as uniformly wise, peaceful, and connected to authentic knowledge, while ignoring evidence of violence, exploitation, and false beliefs within these communities. He projected his own psychedelic experiences onto indigenous practices that may have been quite different. This noble, savage romanticism, while well-intentioned, distorts both indigenous realities and historical facts. The Archaic Revival thesis similarly oversimplifies history. The claim that civilization represents a fall from prehistoric paradise ignores that violence, hierarchy, and environmental destruction existed in many pre-agricultural societies. The idealization of hunter-gatherer life disregards its hardships and limitations. The proposal that we can or should return to archaic consciousness ignores how consciousness co-evolves with material conditions and cannot be voluntarily adopted. McKenna's understanding of science was often superficial and selective. He would cite scientific findings that seemed to support his ideas while ignoring contrary evidence and broader scientific context. His invocations of quantum mechanics, chaos theory, and complexity science typically involved analogies and metaphors rather than rigorous applications of these theories. Actual physicists and mathematicians found his scientific claims confused or simply wrong. The visible language and entity encounters in DMT experiences, which McKenna treated as encounters with actual non-human intelligence, are more parsimoniously explained by neuroscience. The brain contains modules for detecting agency, recognizing faces, and modeling other minds. When these systems operate in altered conditions, they can generate experiences of presence and intentionality where none exists externally. This is not dismissing the experiences, but explaining them without requiring hyperspace or autonomous entities. McKenna's political vision, while appealing to many, lacked practical detail or realistic assessment of obstacles. Calls to dissolve nation-states, legalize all drugs, and reorganize society around small communities sound attractive in lectures but offer no path to implementation. How do 7 billion people transition to such arrangements? How are global problems, like climate change, addressed without large-scale coordination? How are resources distributed? McKenna's politics were more aesthetic than substantive. His technological utopianism, expecting virtual reality and AI to enable consciousness transformation, has aged poorly. Digital technologies have produced as much alienation as connection, as much control as liberation. Social media demonstrates how technology can amplify the worst aspects of human nature. The promise that technology would help realize psychedelic visions remains unfulfilled and may have been naive. Critics also note McKenna's sometimes irresponsible encouragement of high-dose psychedelic use without adequate discussion of risks. Mental health professionals worry that his rhetoric could encourage vulnerable people to take substances that might trigger psychosis, exacerbate anxiety or depression, or cause lasting psychological disturbance. While he occasionally mentioned these risks, his overall message emphasized psychedelics as relatively safe and universally beneficial. The gender dynamics in McKenna's work deserve scrutiny. He spoke often about goddess cultures and the importance of the feminine, but his actual audience and intellectual interlocutors were overwhelmingly male. His emphasis on ayahuasca and mushrooms from male shamanic traditions contrasted with relative neglect of plant medicines associated with female practitioners. Some feminists view his goddess talk as appropriation that does little to challenge actual patriarchal structures. McKenna's writing and speaking style, while entertaining, sometimes prioritized rhetorical impact over accuracy. He would make dramatic claims, use hyperbole, and employ emotional appeals in ways that could mislead audiences. His eloquence made wrong ideas sound plausible and convinced many people of claims that experts knew were false. This raises ethical questions about the responsibilities of public intellectuals. The question of cultural appropriation pervades McKenna's work. He was a white American taking indigenous practices, interpreting them through Western frameworks and presenting them to predominantly white audiences. While he acknowledged debts to indigenous teachers, some native and indigenous scholars view his work as extractive, taking knowledge without proper reciprocity or permission and profiting from others' cultural heritage. Scholarly debates about McKenna's legacy center on how to evaluate thinkers who are eloquent and influential, but scientifically unrigorous. Should we judge them by academic standards they never claimed to meet, or by their impact on culture and consciousness? Do the harms of spreading questionable ideas outweigh benefits of stimulating interest and imagination? How do we separate valuable insights from problematic claims when they are thoroughly intertwined? Some scholars argue that McKenna should be understood as primarily a performance artist or myth-maker rather than a theorist making factual claims. His talks were theatrical events where ideas functioned as provocations and possibilities rather than settled truths. Evaluated as mythology and poetry, his work succeeds even where it fails as science or history. Others counter that McKenna explicitly presented his ideas as true, and this interpretation lets him off too easily. The psychedelic research community remains ambivalent about McKenna's legacy. On one hand, he helped keep interest alive and fought stigmatization when research was impossible. On the other hand, his wilder claims make it harder for scientists to be taken seriously. Researchers must constantly distinguish their rigorous work from McKenna-style speculation, yet they owe him debt for creating cultural space where psychedelic research could eventually resume. Perhaps the deepest critique is that McKenna's work, despite its surface radicalism, ultimately served as a kind of escapism. Rather than engaging with the difficult work of social change, political organizing, or systematic intellectual development, it offered visions of magical transformation through drugs and consciousness shifts. This may have demobilized potential activists, giving them psychedelic fantasies instead of political programs. Yet those who defend McKenna note that perfect consistency and empirical accuracy were never his goals. He saw himself as an explorer reporting from the frontiers of consciousness, offering provisional maps of territories most people never visit. Maps can be useful, even if not perfectly accurate. His ideas stimulated thinking, encouraged experimentation, and helped people make meaning from their own psychedelic experiences. These contributions remain valuable, even if specific theories were wrong. The failures and critiques ultimately reveal McKenna as a brilliant but undisciplined thinker who generated far more ideas than he could adequately develop or defend. His strength was phenomenological description and mythic imagination, not rigorous argumentation or empirical testing. He performed philosophy and cosmology as verbal jazz, improvising connections and possibilities. This made him influential and entertaining, but also ensured that much of his work would not survive serious scrutiny. Part 13. Legacy, Influence and Contemporary Relevance. More than 2 decades after his death in the year 2000, Terence McKenna's influence continues to grow in unexpected ways. His ideas pervade contemporary discussions about psychedelics, consciousness, technology, and the future of humanity. Understanding this legacy requires examining both direct influences on specific fields and his broader cultural impact. The most obvious legacy is in psychedelic culture and research. McKenna almost single-handedly kept psychedelics in public consciousness during decades when research was banned and use was criminalized. His lectures, distributed initially on tapes and later digitized and shared online, introduced millions to the idea that psychedelics deserved serious consideration. Young people encountering his talks in the 1990s and 2000s often report that McKenna opened their minds to possibilities they had never considered. The current psychedelic research renaissance owes significant debt to groundwork McKenna laid. While scientists conducting FDA-approved trials distance themselves from his more speculative ideas, they benefit from cultural acceptance he helped create. The notion that psychedelics might treat mental illness, facilitate spiritual growth, or reveal features of consciousness is no longer dismissed as obviously absurd, partly because McKenna spent decades arguing these points. Contemporary psychedelic therapists and guides often reference McKenna's emphasis on set and setting, even if they do not cite him directly. His phenomenological descriptions help people understand and integrate their own experiences. His frameworks for thinking about entities, dimensions, and consciousness provide language for discussing phenomena that mainstream psychology has difficulty addressing. This influence operates somewhat underground, as therapists must maintain scientific legitimacy while drawing on McKenna's insights. In popular culture, McKenna's influence extends far beyond psychedelic circles. His talks have been remixed into music, sampled by electronic artists, and incorporated into multimedia experiences. His ideas appear in podcasts, documentaries, and online discussions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence. Figures like Joe Rogan, Duncan Trussell, and Graham Hancock explicitly acknowledge McKenna's influence and introduce his ideas to their large audiences. The aesthetic influence is particularly notable. McKenna's descriptions of psychedelic visuals, self-transforming geometries, and impossible architectures have inspired visual artists, designers, and digital creators. The aesthetic associated with psychedelic experience, fractal patterns, flowing geometries, entity encounters reflects McKenna's phenomenological reports as much as any other single source. This aesthetic pervades electronic music culture, festival art, and digital animation. In philosophy of mind and consciousness studies, McKenna's influence is more contested but still present. His insistence that first-person phenomenology matters and cannot be reduced to third-person neuroscience aligns with current debates about the hard problem of consciousness. While few academic philosophers cite McKenna directly, the questions he raised about subjectivity, qualia, and the limits of scientific explanation remain central to the field. The transhumanist and technologist communities show McKenna's influence in discussions about consciousness uploading, virtual reality, and human technological transformation. His vision of technology and psychedelics converging toward consciousness expansion shapes how many think about future possibilities. Silicon Valley figures interested in psychedelics and consciousness often encounter McKenna's ideas and find them provocative, even if not fully convincing. McKenna's critique of civilization and advocacy for the Archaic Revival influence environmental movements, rewilding advocates, and those questioning industrial society's trajectory. His emphasis on indigenous wisdom and ecological consciousness resonates with efforts to develop sustainable relationships with nature. While few advocate literally returning to hunter-gatherer existence, many draw on similar themes about learning from indigenous peoples and recovering ecological sensibility. The Stoned Ape Theory, despite being rejected by scientists, maintains extraordinary cultural presence. It appears regularly in popular discussions of human evolution and consciousness. This reflects how compelling narratives can survive scientific refutation when they satisfy psychological or cultural needs. The theory gives psychedelic users a sense that their experiences connect to something fundamental about human nature, regardless of historical accuracy. Timewave Zero's failure paradoxically enhanced McKenna's mystique in some circles. The apocalyptic expectation it generated contributed to the cultural ferment around 2012, influencing books, films, and discussions about transformation and endings. When no obvious transformation occurred, different interpretations emerged, some seeing subtle shifts in consciousness or culture. The theory's failure became part of McKenna's mythology rather than diminishing his influence. Academic interest in McKenna has increased rather than decreased over time. Dissertations and papers now examine his work from perspectives in religious studies, anthropology, science studies, and cultural analysis. He is studied not primarily as a thinker, whose theories were correct, but as a significant cultural figure whose ideas reveal important features of late 20th century consciousness and counterculture. The archive of McKenna's lectures, now digitized and freely available online, ensures his ideas remain accessible to new generations. Unlike academic papers locked behind paywalls, McKenna's work spreads virally through social media, podcasts, and YouTube videos. This democratic accessibility means his influence extends far beyond academic or elite circles into general culture. McKenna's legacy in ethnobotany is secure. His documentation of indigenous plant use and his cultivation guides democratized access to psychedelic mushrooms. The techniques he helped develop are still used by growers worldwide. His fieldwork contributed to understanding of ayahuasca practices and plant pharmacology. This dimension of his work will continue to be referenced as long as people study psychoactive plants. The question of McKenna's contemporary relevance connects to current crises and transformations. Climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, and mental health epidemics create hunger for new perspectives and solutions. McKenna's ideas about consciousness transformation, technology synthesis, ecological wisdom, and transcendence speak to people seeking alternatives to both conventional politics and traditional religion. However, his relevance must be qualified. The specific theories he proposed, Stoned Ape, Timewave Zero, hyperspace entities, have not proven scientifically valuable. His political program lacks practical detail. His Archaic Revival cannot be implemented at global scale. What remains relevant is his broader sensibility, his willingness to question assumptions, his emphasis on consciousness as primary, his integration of science and mysticism, his sense that something more is possible. The contemporary psychedelic movement both draws from and moves beyond McKenna. It accepts his basic premise that psychedelics are tools worthy of serious attention, but approaches them with more rigor and less metaphysical speculation. It maintains his emphasis on subjective experience while insisting on measurable outcomes. It shares his critique of the war on drugs while avoiding some of his more irresponsible encouragements of use. McKenna's influence on how people think about reality and consciousness may be his most lasting legacy. He gave millions permission to take their experiences seriously, even when they contradict mainstream narratives. He demonstrated that one could be intellectually curious and rigorous while also embracing wonder and mystery. He modelled how to synthesize diverse sources into personal meaning systems. These are not small contributions. The dangers in his legacy also persist. His ideas can encourage magical thinking and rejection of scientific method. They can lead people to overestimate psychedelics' benefits and underestimate risks. They can promote cultural appropriation and romanticization of indigenous peoples. They can substitute pleasant speculation for difficult work of understanding and changing reality. These problems require ongoing critical engagement with his legacy. Future developments will determine how McKenna is ultimately remembered. If psychedelic medicine becomes widely accepted, he will be seen as a visionary who advocated for research decades before mainstream science caught up. If technological transformation toward greater consciousness occurs, his synthesis of psychedelics and technology will seem prescient. If neither happens, he will be remembered as a compelling thinker whose ideas reflected late 20th century hopes and fears, but did not accurately predict the future. What seems certain is that McKenna will not be forgotten. His ideas are too widely distributed, his talks too entertaining, his questions too provocative. Whether studied academically, celebrated in psychedelic culture, or critiqued by skeptics, his work remains a reference point for discussions about consciousness, psychedelics, and human possibility. This cultural persistence is itself a kind of success, regardless of whether his specific theories were correct. Part 14. Final Synthesis and Evaluation. After examining all dimensions of Terence McKenna's philosophy, we can now attempt a comprehensive evaluation that recognizes both contributions and failures, insights and delusions, brilliance and blind spots. This synthesis must avoid two opposite errors: dismissing him as mere pseudoscience or accepting him uncritically as visionary prophet. The truth, as usually the case, is more complex and interesting. McKenna's greatest strength was phenomenological description. His reports of psychedelic experiences remain among the most articulate and detailed available. He captured in language what many people experience but struggle to express. This phenomenological richness provides valuable data for researchers studying consciousness, even when his metaphysical interpretations are rejected. Simply knowing what it feels like to encounter entities in DMT space or to experience temporal dissolution on psilocybin contributes to understanding these phenomena. His second major contribution was cultural and political. By speaking eloquently and publicly about psychedelics for 3 decades, he helped shift cultural attitudes from pure prohibition and stigmatization toward greater openness and curiosity. While he was not alone in this effort, his particular combination of scientific vocabulary, mystical sensibility, and countercultural credibility reached audiences that academic researchers could not. The current research renaissance exists partly because people like McKenna kept the flame alive. Third, McKenna asked important questions that mainstream science and philosophy had neglected or dismissed. What is the nature of subjective experience? Can consciousness be reduced to brain activity? What do altered states reveal about the mind and reality? How should we integrate insights from non-Western traditions? Why has Western civilization suppressed consciousness exploration? These remain vital questions, even when McKenna's answers were wrong. Fourth, his ethnobotanical work contributed genuine knowledge about plant medicines and indigenous practices. His documentation of ayahuasca use, his cultivation techniques for psilocybin mushrooms, his field work with various shamanic traditions, all added to the scientific literature. This work had more lasting value than his theoretical speculations precisely because it was grounded in careful observation and practical knowledge. Fifth, McKenna demonstrated how to synthesize diverse intellectual traditions into coherent worldviews. He drew from Indigenous shamanism, Western esotericism, Eastern mysticism, contemporary science, and psychedelic phenomenology to create a unique vision. While this synthesis was not always rigorous, It modeled how people can build personal philosophies from multiple sources rather than accepting any single tradition as authoritative. This approach suits the pluralistic reality of contemporary life. However, McKenna's weaknesses were equally significant. His most fundamental failure was epistemological. He could not distinguish between profound experiences and accurate knowledge. The fact that psychedelics produce meaningful experiences does not mean those experiences reveal objective truths about reality. By treating psychedelic gnosis as self-validating, he created an unfalsifiable system insulated from criticism and correction. This methodological error undermined everything he built on it. Second, his theoretical work lacked the rigor necessary for serious intellectual contribution. He would develop elaborate theories, Stoned Ape, Timewave Zero, Hyperspace dimensions, without adequate evidence or careful argumentation. When these theories faced criticism from experts, he would retreat into unfalsifiability or dismiss critics as closed-minded. This is not how serious intellectual work proceeds, and it explains why academics generally dismissed his ideas. Third, McKenna romanticized both indigenous cultures and prehistoric life in ways that distorted reality. His Archaic Revival thesis presented hunter-gatherers as uniformly wise and peaceful, while ignoring evidence of violence, hierarchy, and environmental destruction in many such societies. His treatment of shamanism idealized indigenous practices while ignoring their exploitation and false beliefs. This noble savage mythology, though well-intentioned, perpetuates harmful stereotypes. Fourth, his political and social vision, while appealing aesthetically, lacked practical substance. Calls to dissolve civilization, legalize all drugs, and return to small communities sound attractive in lectures, but offer no realistic path to implementation. The actual work of social transformation requires engagement with institutions, compromise and incremental change, none of which fit McKenna's apocalyptic temperament. His politics were ultimately escapist rather than effective. Fifth, McKenna's encouragement of psychedelic use without adequate discussion of risks was irresponsible. While he occasionally mentioned dangers, his overall message minimized them in favor of emphasizing benefits. This could lead vulnerable people to take substances that might trigger lasting psychological problems. Public intellectuals have duties to balance enthusiasm with caution, which McKenna did not always fulfill. The question of how to evaluate McKenna ultimately depends on what standards we apply. Judged as science, much of his work fails. The Stoned Ape Theory is unfounded, Timewave Zero was falsified, Hyperspace claims are unverifiable. Judged as philosophy, his arguments are often weak, relying on unfalsifiable premises and insufficient rigor. Judged as scholarship, he cherry-picked evidence and ignored contrary findings. But judged as cultural intervention, myth-making and consciousness exploration, McKenna succeeds more often than he fails. He changed how millions of people think about psychedelics, consciousness and reality. He created compelling narratives that help people make meaning from unusual experiences. He challenged assumptions that needed challenging. He demonstrated that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in conventional philosophy. Perhaps the best way to understand McKenna is as a shaman for the modern world, translating between domains of experience that modernity usually keeps separate. Shamans in traditional societies mediate between ordinary and non-ordinary reality, bringing knowledge from altered states back to the community. McKenna did something similar, reporting from psychedelic territories and attempting to integrate those experiences into broader understanding. That his interpretations were sometimes wrong does not negate the value of the mediation itself. The paradox of McKenna is that his failures and successes are deeply intertwined. His willingness to make bold claims without adequate evidence was both what made him influential and what made him wrong. His refusal to accept disciplinary boundaries allowed creative synthesis, but ensured his work would not meet academic standards. His mystical certainty about psychedelic revelations gave him conviction to speak publicly, but led him into unfalsifiable speculation. For those engaging with McKenna's work today, the appropriate stance is neither acceptance nor rejection, but critical appreciation. Take seriously his phenomenological reports while remaining skeptical about his metaphysical interpretations. Learn from his courage to question orthodoxy while avoiding his tendency towards pseudoscience. Draw on his integrative vision while maintaining more rigor than he did. Appreciate his contributions while acknowledging his failures. The ultimate significance of McKenna may lie not in his specific ideas, but in what he represents. An attempt to expand human consciousness and imagination beyond the limits imposed by both scientific materialism and religious orthodoxy. Whether consciousness is actually fundamental, whether other dimensions exist, whether history has a telos, these questions may never be definitively answered. But asking them, exploring them, imagining alternatives, this work matters regardless of where it leads. McKenna's legacy will continue evolving as psychedelic research progresses, as consciousness studies develops, as technology transforms human possibilities. Some of his ideas will be vindicated in modified forms, while others will be remembered only as interesting failures. The psychedelics he championed are now recognized as valuable therapeutic tools, though not quite in the ways he imagined. The questions he raised about consciousness remain at the frontier of science and philosophy. In the end, Terence McKenna was a brilliant, flawed, and genuinely original thinker who made important contributions while also spreading ideas that do not withstand scrutiny. He was neither prophet nor fraud, but something more interesting, a consciousness explorer who reported what he found with rare eloquence, even when what he found was partly illusion. His work deserves serious engagement, not as settled truth, but as provocative challenge to think differently about consciousness, reality, and human possibility. The call that runs through all McKenna's work is to take consciousness seriously, to explore its full range, to question received wisdom, and to imagine new possibilities. This call remains valid, even when specific answers to it prove inadequate. We are consciousness exploring itself, trying to understand what we are and what we might become. McKenna's life work was an extraordinary contribution to that ongoing exploration, flawed but valuable, wrong about many things, but right about what matters most, that the adventure of consciousness is worth pursuing wherever it leads. This concludes our comprehensive analysis of all of Terence McKenna's ideas and philosophy. We have examined his foundations in psychedelic epistemology, his evolutionary theories, his ideas about time and novelty, his vision of archaic revival, his theories of language and reality, his concept of the transcendental object, his ethnobotanical contributions, his technological prophecies, his engagement with esotericism, his ontology of hyperspace, his relationship with science, the major critiques and failures of his work, his lasting legacy and influence, And finally, our synthesis, attempting to evaluate his overall significance. McKenna remains a figure whose influence continues to grow even as his specific theories face increasing scrutiny. Understanding his work comprehensively, both its genuine insights and its serious problems, is essential for anyone interested in psychedelics, consciousness studies, or the cultural history of late 20th century America. His ideas will continue provoking thought, inspiring exploration, and generating debate for generations to come.